An entire city is slowly dying, and no one understands why. The salt isn't coming, the soldiers aren't getting paid, the treasury is empty. But the man who woke up in this world a day ago already sees a way out. Because for 8 years, all he did was fix broken chains like these. Let's rewind. The cold hits first. Stony. Daniel Park opens his eyes and stares at the vaulted ceiling, all cracks. Light pours through the stained glass windows. Too yellow. Not Seattle. Not Earth. He sits up. The back of his head throbs as if someone had hit him with a brick. The clothes are unfamiliar. Coarse fabric. Laces instead of a zipper. Boots instead of sneakers. And then a panel flashes before his eyes. It glows blue right in the air. Day 1. Gift of the day. 50 gold seorens. He pokes at it with his finger. His fingers pass right through. The panel goes dark. A wallet stuffed with coins jingles in his pocket. 3 options spin through his head like a system rebooting after a crash. Coma, death, the most detailed dream in history. In any of the 3, panicking is pointless. Panic isn't part of the KPI. He stands up. An abandoned chapel. Dust on the altar a finger's width thick. The door is ajar, and behind it lies the living world. Voices, the creak of wheels, the lowing of cattle. He pushes the door open and steps out. Light stings his eyes. A dirt road rutted by hooves. Roofs ahead. A small town of stone and wood. A woman is dragging a basket of bread. Boys are running with sticks, pretending to be knights. The Middle Ages. The present. At the chapel gate, he nearly trips over her. A girl of about 12, red-haired, skinny, freckles like scattered cinnamon. She holds out a wooden tray with 4 stale flatbreads and raises one finger. 1 copper coin. Daniel doesn't know the exchange rate, but he knows something else. In 8 years in logistics, he's learned one thing. Information is more valuable than any commodity. He pulls out a gold coin and places it in her hand. The girl looks at the coin, then at him. She grabs it with both hands as if afraid he'll change his mind, and she cries silently. He realizes 2 things at once. He overpaid 1,000-fold and made the best deal of his career. Her name is Lena. The town is called Stonebrook. He takes a bite of the flatbread and nearly breaks a tooth. He gives her a thumbs up. She smiles for the first time. Lena leads him to the market. The market is always the right place to start. Stonebrook is more than it seems. Stone walls. Guards at the gates are snoring and don't ask for papers. Inside, narrow streets. The smell of leather and fish. Daniel walks and counts out of habit. 12 stalls. 3 taverns. The market is sparse. Lots of grain, little meat. There's salt, but it's expensive. He sees a woman haggling over a pinch of salt and walking away empty-handed. He remembers. He buys Lena 3 bowls of hot bowls of porridge in a row and realizes she's constantly starving. He looks away. Not the time to get attached. First, figure out where you are. Then save the world. All day he listens to the market and soaks up the language. By evening, he knows 40 words. 3 are heard most often. King, soldier, war. And at those words, faces turn gray. The city is afraid of something. He rents a room in a cheap tavern for silver. He counts his purse. 47 gold pieces. He falls asleep thinking not of home, nor of his mother, whom he never called, but of how Lina held the coin and cried, and of how that single gold piece did more than all his quarterly reports over 8 years. A ringing sound wakes him at dawn. The sign hangs in the air again. Day 2. Gift of the day, a sack of rock salt, 20 pounds. In the corner stands a sack that wasn't there last night. Heavy, the real thing. Daniel stuck his hand inside and smiled for the first time. Not out of joy, from recognition. This is a task, and he solves tasks. He goes to the market to the salt counter. The merchant Beren, tired eyes, an empty display case. Daniel speaks with a stutter, but numbers are universal. He draws diagrams with his finger right in the dust, and he gets everything out of Baron. 3 months ago, the salt caravan from Valmarsh stopped coming. The roads are swarming with bandits and deserters. The garrison isn't guarding them because the soldiers aren't being paid. Prices are skyrocketing. Daniel puts it all together in his head. The salt isn't coming because the roads are empty. The roads are empty because the soldiers aren't being paid. The soldiers aren't being paid because the treasury is empty. The treasury is empty because trade has ground to a halt. Trade has ground to a halt because the salt isn't coming. A vicious cycle. A classic broken chain. He's seen this 100 times. The solution is always the same. Find an entry point. Inject resources. Start the cycle. He doesn't sell salt to Baron. He offers a partnership. Baron sells his salt at 20% below market price. They split the profits. Baron stares for a long time. Then he slaps the dare. By lunchtime, the first buyers are carrying the salt home. But it's not about the money. Now Daniel knows Baron, and Baron knows all the merchants, the caravan captains, and every road in the region. After lunch, he heads to the garrison, a stone barracks by the north gate. In the courtyard, 15 soldiers in rags are playing dice and drinking swill. Weapons are rusting in their racks. No one stands up. He asks for the captain. He enters. The table is covered with papers, a map on the wall, and a man at the table, broad as if carved from stone, a scar from temple to chin, eyes red from lack of sleep. Captain Gregor. He throws out a single phrase. If you're just another tax collector, get out of here. There's nothing to take. Daniel doesn't leave. He sits down across from him. He dumps 10 gold coins on the table. Gregor falls silent. Daniel says he's a merchant and has a proposal. And he starts asking questions. How many men? 42. There used to be 60. When were they last paid? 6 weeks ago. Why do they stay? Gregor is silent the longest. Because half of them have families here. If they leave, the city will be left defenseless, and their wives and children will be the first to be robbed on roads. Daniel nods. He recognizes this. The company is on the verge of bankruptcy, where people stick around not for the money, but because they have nowhere else to go. The most valuable employees. For 2 hours, he asks questions, listens, calculates, and sketches on parchment. And he gets to the heart of the matter. The garrison has a warehouse. In the warehouse are 120 iron ingots confiscated from smugglers 6 months ago. No one has claimed them. No one has accounted for them. Iron is money. Big money. But Gregor has no right to sell it. He's a soldier. And the requisition papers are lost. And that's when Daniel smiles for the first time during the entire conversation. Papers. That's exactly where he can help. The morning of the third day began with another ring. Day 3, gift of the day, a set of silver spoons, 12 of them. Daniel sat on the bed and looked at the box of spoons. Beautiful, heavy, engraved, completely useless in his current situation. He sighed. The system was playing a joke, or testing him, or maybe it didn't care. In any case, silver is silver. He put the box under the bed and went downstairs for breakfast. Overnight, his brain had processed the language again. Words were forming into sentences. He still spoke with an accent and mixed up the cases, but he understood almost everything now. It was abnormally fast. Maybe the system was helping with that too. Maybe his brain was just working at its limit because his survival depended on it. He didn't bother to figure it out. He accepted it as a given and went to work. First thing he did, he went back to Baron. The salt had been sold. All of it. In half a day. Baron was standing behind the counter and looked as if he'd seen a ghost. He said there hadn't been such demand in 3 months. People had found out that salt was available at a normal price and had come in first thing in the morning, some from neighboring villages. Daniel took his share, 6 gold coins and a handful of silver. Then he pulled out the spoons. Baron looked at them. His eyes lit up. Engraved silver spoons aren't just cutlery, they're status symbols. Merchants and the lower nobility buy them for formal dinners. Baron said he knew a buyer, a jeweler on the next street. They went together. The jeweler's name was Master Holt, an old man with a magnifying glass on a chain. He examined each spoon, tested the silver with his teeth. Then he named a price. 14 gold coins for the set. Daniel didn't haggle. He took the money. He thanked him. He left. Baron walked beside him, shaking his head. He said that Daniel could have gotten 16. Daniel replied that 2 gold pieces was the price of a jeweler's goodwill. The next time he needed something appraised or sold, Holt would remember the customer who didn't haggle. Baron fell silent. He looked at Daniel as if he were a man who had just said something very simple and very incomprehensible at the same time. By noon, Daniel was back at the barracks. Gregor was waiting. He looked as if he hadn't slept. Again. Daniel sat down at the table and laid out his plan. Not on parchment, verbally. He already had enough words. He spoke for 15 minutes. Gregor listened without interrupting. Here's what Daniel proposed. The iron in the warehouse is worth about 80 gold pieces at current prices. Maybe more. There are no papers for it, so officially, it doesn't exist. Daniel takes care of the paperwork. He'll draw up an inventory report. He'll register it as confiscated property in the city's name. The captain's signature. The signatures of 2 witnesses. The garrison's seal. All by the book. The iron is sold through Barine, who knows the wholesale buyers. 20 gold pieces from the proceeds go toward the garrison's pay for the first 2 weeks. Another 20 go into the reserve for the next 2. The rest goes toward repairing weapons and purchasing provisions. Gregor was silent. Then he asked why Daniel needed this, what he wanted in return. Daniel answered simply. He needed a city that functioned. Guarded roads, safe caravans, trade that flows, because he intended to stay here. And he needed allies, not supplicants. Gregor looked at him for a long time, with the heavy gaze of a man accustomed to being lied to. Then he stood up. He held out his hand. They shook hands. Gregor said that if Daniel kept his word, he would get the best soldiers on this side of the river, and that if he cheated, Gregor would personally slit his throat. Daniel replied that these were the most honest terms of a contract he had ever heard in his entire career. Gregor didn't understand the word career, but he understood the tone, and for the first time during the entire conversation, he smirked. Daniel worked until evening. It was a familiar state of affairs. 8 years in the office had trained him to a single rhythm: task, resources, deadline, action. He sat at the table in Gregor's room and wrote a warehouse inventory report, a copy for the garrison, a copy for the city council. Written language was harder for him than spoken, but the structure of the document was universal: date, title, quantity, signatures. He wrote slowly. He corrected. He rewrote. Gregor stood nearby and looked over his shoulder. At some point, the captain quietly remarked that in 12 years of service, this was the first time he'd seen anyone process confiscated goods by the book. Usually, they'd just take it and forget about it. Without looking up, Daniel replied that paper is a shield. A sword can defend against 1 man, paper against 1,000. Gregor pondered this. It was clear that the idea was new to him. By evening, the documents were ready. Gregor signed them. He called in 2 senior sergeants. They signed as witnesses. The garrison seal was stamped in wax. That was it. The iron was now official. Tomorrow, Baron would start looking for buyers. The day after tomorrow, there would be money. In 3 days, the soldiers would receive their pay. In a week, it would be possible to talk about patrolling the roads. A chain, link by link. Daniel returned to the tavern. Lena was waiting at the door. She came every evening. She brought him something. Today, a bundle of dried herbs that, according to her, helped with headaches. He took the herbs. He thanked her. She ran off. He went up to his room. He sat on the bed. He looked at his budget. 50 gold pieces from the first day. -1 for Lena. -15 for Baron for the first batch. +6 from the sale. +14 for the spoons. Minus expenses for food and lodging. Total, about 52 gold pieces. More than he started with. That was good. But the money would run out. It always does. He needed a steady source of income. He needed trade. And trade required safe roads. The circle closed in on Gregor and his men. Everything hinged on tomorrow, on iron, on the first pay the soldiers would receive in a month and a half. On the fourth day, the gift was strange. Day 4, gift of the day. A map of the Valmarsh region, up to date. Daniel unfolded it on the table and froze. It was a treasure. Not gold, not weapons. Information. The map was detailed. Cities, villages, roads, rivers, forests, mountains, borders. He saw Stonebrook, a tiny dot in the northwest, by the sea. 3 roads led from it. One south to the capital of Valmarch, called Kronheim. One east to the pass leading to the Empire of Ostrakomnia. One to the west along the coast toward the fishing villages. He saw the scale. Valmarsh was tiny, sandwiched between the mountains and the sea. 3 cities, a dozen villages, 1 salt mine by the coast, 1 port, and the border with the Empire, which, on the map, looked like a wall compared to a fence. He sat over the map for 2 hours, memorizing. He calculated distances. He mapped out routes. Baron said that the salt caravans went from the mine through Kronheim and further east over the pass. That route is dead now. Bandits, deserters, no guards. But Daniel saw another way, by sea. From the mine along the coast to the port. From the port south by sea. Longer, but safer, if there are ships. He rolled up the map and hid it under his mattress. That was his advantage. No one in town had a map like that. Knowing the territory is half the battle. The other half is the people who live in that territory. Baron found a buyer for the iron faster than Daniel expected. A blacksmith from a neighboring town. He came himself with 2 carts. He inspected the ingots. He haggled for an hour. Daniel was present. He remained silent. He let Baron lead the negotiations. This was important. Baron needed to feel like a partner, not a middleman. The final price? 92 gold pieces for the entire shipment. More than Daniel had anticipated. The iron turned out to be of good quality. The money was distributed according to plan. 20 for the garrison, 20 for the reserve, 10 for Baron for his work, and the rest for repairs and provisions. That evening, Gregor lined up his men in the barracks courtyard. Daniel stood aside and watched. The captain handed out the coins personally, into each man's hand, calling them by name. 42 men, 42 names. Daniel memorized the faces. That, too, was a habit. In his previous company, he knew by name every driver, every courier, every storekeeper. Not because he was kind, but because a man known by name works differently. When the last soldier received his pay and left, Gregor approached Daniel. He stood there for a moment. He was silent. Then he said one sentence. He asked if Daniel was an advisor to some king. Daniel shook his head. He replied that not yet, but they would fix that. Gregor looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. And from that moment on, Daniel knew that Captain Gregor would be with him. He devoted the 5th and 6th days to the roads. Gregor assigned 10 men to the patrol. Not everyone. The city needed guarding too. 10 is not many, but 10 armed soldiers on the road is the difference between a caravan that passes through and a caravan that turns back. Daniel went with the first patrol. Gregor was against it. He said there was no need for a civilian to go out on the road. Daniel replied that he needed to see the route with his own eyes. You can't manage what you haven't seen. Gregor grumbled something about stubborn foreigners and handed him a leather breastplate and a short knife. Daniel took the knife. He turned it over in his hands. He had never held a weapon. Not in that life, nor in this one. The knife felt awkward in his hand. Gregor looked at the way Daniel was holding the weapon and told him to stay behind everyone else. The road south of Stonebrook ran through a forest. Thick, dark. Pine trees and some other trees Daniel didn't recognize. Thick trunks, moss on the rocks, a silence that weighed on his ears. The patrol moved in silence. The soldiers knew their business. 2 hours later, they found tracks, a fire pit, bones, scraps of cloth, a bandit camp, empty. They'd left recently. Gregor surveyed the site and said there had been about 20 of them, deserters from the southern garrisons. They head into the woods when their pay stops coming and rob caravans. Daniel listened and thought. 20 deserters, 10 soldiers. The math doesn't add up. We can't fight them. But we can't just leave them either. He asked Gregor where the bandits went in the winter. Gregor replied that they went to the pass. There were abandoned mines there, warm from underground springs. Daniel looked at the map, the pass, the mines, the only route into the empire of Ostrocomnia. He began to see the outlines of something bigger. But for now, he remained silent. It was too early. He needed more information. The patrol returned by evening. No clashes. The mere presence of an armed group on the road was a clear enough signal. On the way back, they encountered a merchant's wagon, 2 traders with a load of wool. They were traveling from a village in the south and couldn't believe their eyes when they saw soldiers on the road. One of them said it was the first patrol in 3 months. Daniel took note. The 7th day changed everything. The system's gift was ordinary, a coil of good rope, useful but not revolutionary. Something else was the revolution. Baron brought a person to him, a girl, young, 19 years old, thin, dark hair, eyes downcast, hands clasped in front of her. Her clothes were clean but patched in 10 places. Baron said she was Marco Khan's daughter. The name made Daniel sit up and take notice. He'd heard it before. Marco Khan had been a major salt merchant, once upon a time. 3 years ago, he'd gone bankrupt. His partners had cheated him, falsified the accounts, stolen the goods. Marco had tried to take them to court. The court sided with those who had more money, as usual. Marco lost everything. His house, warehouses, his reputation. Now he worked as a dock worker at the port. And his daughter, Sori, stood before Daniel and said nothing, because over the past 3 years, she had forgotten how to speak to people who could help her. Baron explained. Sori owed the moneylender 40 gold pieces, her father's debt, interest, penalties. If she didn't pay by the end of the week, she'd be sent to the debtor's pit, a prison for debtors. People work there until they've paid off their debt. Some don't come out for years. Daniel looked at Sori. Then he asked her to sit down. She sat on the edge of the chair, like a bird ready to take flight at the slightest movement. He asked her what her father did for a living. She answered quietly. The salt trade, wholesale deliveries, 3 routes, 12 regular customers. He asked who kept the books. She looked up. For the first time, she looked him straight in the eye. She replied that she did, since she was 14. Daniel took a handful of coins out of his pocket. Different kinds, gold, silver, copper. He poured them onto the table. He asked her to count the total. Sori looked at the coins. Her lips moved. 3 seconds. She named the number. Daniel counted them over. Sori was right, down to the last coin, in 3 seconds, without an abacus, without notes, in his head. He leaned back in his chair and, for the first time in 7 days in this world, felt something akin to excitement. Not the thrill of gambling. Professional. The very same feeling he'd had when, during an interview, he'd come across a candidate who made him want to stand up and shake their hand before the interview was even over. Daniel paid off his debt to Sori that very day, 40 gold pieces to the moneylender. It was almost half of everything he had. When Gregor found out, he called him a madman. Baron shook his head. Even Lena, who understood the least about money, looked at him with concern. Daniel didn't bother to explain. He didn't need to. He knew one thing none of them knew. A person who can calculate faster than an abacus is worth more than 40 gold pieces, worth more than 400, and more than 4,000. because money can be earned, but talent cannot be bought. He didn't just buy her out of debt. He offered her a job. Not right away. First, he took her to his room in the tavern. Not in that sense. He sat her down at the table and took out all his notes. In a week, he had filled 12 sheets of parchment. Prices of goods, garrison expenses, income from the sale of iron and salt, routes on the map, lists of names. He laid everything out before her and asked her to put it in order. Sori looked at the papers and said nothing. Then her hands began to move. She took sheet after sheet, read, set aside, grouped. An hour later, there were 4 neat stacks on the table. Income, expenses, contacts, plans. She looked at him and said he had no accounting system, that it was all in his head, that this wouldn't do, that in a month he'd get confused and lose money. Daniel smiled. It was the first thing she'd said to him on her own initiative, and it was criticism. Perfect. He explained to her what he wanted. Not a ledger of income and expenses, a system. Double entry bookkeeping. Every transaction is recorded twice. Where the money came from and where it went. Debit and credit. The balance is checked at the end of each day. If it doesn't balance, there's a mistake. Sori listened. Her eyes changed. From dull, they became bright. She asked questions. Lots of questions. The right questions. What if goods haven't been sold yet but have already been paid for? How do you record that? What if a debt is paid in installments? What if expenses of one type recur every week? Do you need a separate line item? Daniel answered, sometimes precisely, sometimes roughly, because he wasn't an accountant himself. He was a manager. He knew the principles. Sori would fill in the details herself. And she did. By evening, Daniel Park's first ledger lay on the table. Neat, precise, with columns and totals and dates. Sori chewed on the tip of her pen when she thought. He noticed this habit and remembered it. The next 3 days were filled with work. In the morning, Daniel worked with Gregor. They planned patrols. They assigned shifts. They drew up a schedule for weapon repairs. Gregor grumbled at every new document. He said they used to get by without paperwork. Daniel patiently explained, when you have 10 soldiers and you know each one, you don't need paperwork. When there are 100, without paperwork, chaos will ensue. Gregor asked where 100 soldiers would come from. Daniel replied that from the same place as the 42. People go where they're paid on time and fed their fill. Reputation. After lunch, Daniel worked with Baron. They compiled a list of goods that Stonebrook could produce or resell. Salt, fish, wool, leather, ironwork from the forge, wood from the surrounding forests. Not a rich selection, but a workable one. In the evening, he worked with Sori. She kept the books. He taught her what he knew. Not just bookkeeping, principles, how to assess risk, how to measure profit, not only in money, but also in connections. How to understand that a profitable deal can be a trap if the partner is unreliable. Sori absorbed everything, like dry earth absorbs water, quickly, eagerly, without leaving a trace. Sometimes he caught her gaze on him, not admiring, studying. She tried to figure out how he knew all this. He didn't say. It was too soon. On the 10th day, news arrived. Bad news. Baron brought rumors from the market. Chaos in the capital Kronheim. The Regency Council had finally collapsed. 3 regent lords were fighting over the throne like dogs over a bone. The army had split. The treasury had been plundered. The embassy of the Empire of Ostrocom was negotiating a so-called friendly annexation, which meant conquest, just wrapped up in pretty packaging. The deadline. By the end of winter. 3 months. Daniel sat in his room and stared at the map. Valmarsh. 200,000 souls, 3 cities, 1 mine, 1 port, and no central authority. A shattered kingdom without a king, without an army, without money, with the enemy at the gates. He closed his eyes. In his previous life, the most difficult crisis of his career had been when the warehouse in Tacoma flooded and he had to reroute shipments through Portland in 3 days. He'd managed it. He received a bonus and a commendation from the regional director. Now the task was the same, only on a larger scale, and the warehouse was an entire kingdom, and instead of flooding, there was war. He drew up a plan. Not a military one, a management one. First item, Stonebrook must become a functioning unit. Economy, security, order, already in progress. Second point, communication with other cities. Kronheim and the port of Eldenvale. What's happening there? Who's in control? What resources? Third point, information about the Empire of Ostrocomnia. Their goals, their timelines, their weaknesses. Every counterpart has weaknesses. You just need to know where to look. Fourth point, people. He needs people. Not soldiers, administrators, managers. Those who can take on a piece of work and carry it out without supervision. He looked at his team. Gregor, military strength. Reliable, but thinks in terms of orders and obedience. Baron, trade connections. Reliable, but cautious to the point of cowardice. Sori, numbers. Talented, but insecure and afraid of making mistakes. Lena, eyes and ears on the streets. A 12-year-old girl who knows every alley and every face in Stonebrook. 4 people, 4 skills. Not a single overlap. Not bad for a start, but not enough. Catastrophically not enough. On the 11th day, the gift came in handy. A writing set, good ink, 10 quills, a stack of blank parchment. Sori saw the parchment and laughed for the first time in his presence. Quietly, briefly, but she laughed. She said that parchment in Stonebrook was worth its weight in silver, that merchants wrote on scraps of leather and wooden tablets, that his notes on regular parchment looked like royal decrees. Daniel thought about it and realized something. Paper. Paper was no paper here. Parchment was made from leather, time-consuming, expensive. In his world, paper had been invented in China 2,000 years ago. The technology was simple: plant fibers, water, a press, drying. He didn't know the exact recipe, but he knew the principle, and that was enough. He wrote a single word on his list of projects: paper. Then he underlined it and went to work. The 12th day brought the first conflict. The Stonebrook City Council, 5 people, elders, merchants. One of them was the owner of the largest tavern in town. They came to Daniel, or rather, he came to them because Baron had advised him to. The council was meeting in a building near the market square, a large room, a long table, 5 chairs on one side, 1 chair on the other, for the petitioners. Daniel sat down in that chair and waited 3 minutes for the elders to finish whispering among themselves. Then the eldest spoke, a fat man with a gold chain around his neck. His name was Aldrich. He said that the council knew about Daniel's activities, about the iron, about the patrols, about trading with Barine, and that the council wanted to know who had given him the right to do this in their city. Daniel had expected this. He was even surprised it had taken so long. Every organization has an established power structure. If you start acting without asking permission, sooner or later that structure will react. He replied calmly. He said that no one had given him the right, that he had acted out of necessity. The garrison was running out of money. The roads were dangerous. Trade had come to a standstill. He offered a solution. Aldrich frowned. The other 4 remained silent. Aldrich said that decisions in Stonebrook were made by the council, that an outsider had no place here, that the garrison answered to the council, not to passing merchants. Daniel didn't argue. Arguing is a losing strategy when you have no power. Instead, he asked a question. He asked Aldrich when the council had last paid the garrison's wages. Silence. Then another elder, a thin one, with a beard. He said it wasn't the council's business. Pay comes from the capital, from the treasury. And the treasury is empty. Daniel nodded. He asked a second question. How many caravans had passed through Stonebrook in the last month? A longer silence. Aldrich answered. Not a single one. Daniel nodded again. He asked a third question. If, in 2 months, the Empire of Sharpstone came to the walls of Stonebrook, who would defend it? The silence was the longest yet. Aldrich flushed. He said it was a threat. Daniel shook his head. He replied that it was arithmetic. 42 soldiers without pay. A wall that hadn't been repaired in 3 years. Not a single ally. Not a single caravan. Not a single gold coin in the city treasury. That wasn't a threat. It was a fact. And facts don't get any better just because you ignore them. The council was silent. Daniel stood up. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't make threats. He didn't try to persuade them. He said one thing, that in 2 weeks he would bring the first trade caravan in 3 months to Stonebrook, that this caravan would bring goods, that the merchants would pay the city a duty, that the council would get its share, and that if, after that, the council still wanted him to leave, he would leave, without arguments. Aldrich looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. Daniel left. Gregor was waiting for him outside. The captain was leaning against the wall, cleaning his nails with a knife. He asked how it went. Daniel replied that he had 2 weeks to perform a small miracle. Gregor snorted. He said there were no small miracles. Daniel replied that there were, you just had to make them happen. He organized it. The next 12 days were the busiest of his life, of both his lives. He sent Baron down the coast to the fishing villages with an offer. Bring your fish to Stonebrook. There's a patrol on the road. Safety guaranteed. Fixed purchase price. He sent Gregor with a detachment to the southern road. Don't fight. Show a presence. Clear out 2 bandit camps that turned out to be empty. The bandits had gone deeper into the forest. The mere presence of the patrol was enough. He put Sori in charge of the accounts. He asked her to draw up a complete balance sheet for the city. All income, all expenses, all debts, all assets. Sori worked day and night, wore out her pen. She cursed under her breath at the numbers that didn't add up. She found errors in the city council's old ledgers. Errors that had cost Stonebrook hundreds of gold pieces over the past few years. She brought Daniel the final sheet, and he saw the whole picture. Stonebrook wasn't just poor. Stonebrook had been robbed. The city treasury was leaking through a dozen holes. Inflated prices for wall repairs. Dead souls on the employee lists. Customs duties that were collected but never made it into the treasury. Aldrich. Of course. Daniel folded the papers, put them in a chest, locked it. Not the time. The caravan arrived on the 13th day. Not from the south, nor from the east. From the sea. 3 fishing boats with their catch. 2 carts with wool from the coastal villages. And 1 merchant, an old man named Rolf. He traded in cloth between the coast and the mountain settlements. For the past 6 months, he idled in the port of Eldenvale because the caravan routes had closed. Baron found him. He told him about Stonebrook, about the patrols on the roads, about a man who pays on time and keeps his word. Rolf didn't believe him. He came to check it out. When he saw the soldiers at the gate and the market square bustling with trade again, he sat down on a step and rubbed his eyes for a long time. Then he asked where this man was. Baron took him to D'Angel. Rolf turned out to be more useful than 3 caravans. He knew the coast, every cove, every port, every captain, and he knew the most important thing. The port of Eldenvale is alive. Barely, but alive. The salt mine is operating, at a minimum, because there's no one to transport the salt to the mainland. The roads are cut off. Only the sea remains. But maritime trade requires organization, which doesn't exist. Captains are acting on their own. competing instead of cooperating. Cargo is getting lost. There are no schedules. Prices are all over the place. Daniel listened and took it all in. That was his job, literally. For 8 years, that was exactly what he'd been doing. Supply chains, logistics, transportation coordination. The only difference was that instead of trucks and containers, there were boats and carts. But the principles were the same. He spent Rolf for 2 days. They pored over a map, calculating routes, travel time, boat capacity, shipping costs. Sori wrote down every number. By the end of the second day, they had a plan. The shipping line, Eldenvale, Stonebrook. Then, along the coast to 2 trading cities beyond Valmarsh. 3 voyages a month, a fixed schedule. Cargo is consolidated at the ports. Prices are agreed upon in advance. Rolf coordinates the captains. Baron handles sales in Stonebrook. Daniel finances the first 3 voyages out of his own pocket, a 20 gold investment. Rolf looked at the diagram on the parchment and said nothing. Then he said that in 50 years of trade, he had never seen anyone draw a route like a battle plan. Daniel replied that trade is a battle, just with different weapons. The 14th day, a gift from the system. A bronze medallion with an inscription in a language Daniel didn't know. Beautiful, heavy, mysterious. He put it in his pocket and forgot about it for 3 days. Then he regretted it. But more on that later. Rolf's caravan headed back to the coast with its first shipment. Salt from Baron's reserves. Ironware from the smithy. Pieces of woolen cloth from local weavers. Not much, but it was the first goods to leave Stonebrook in 3 months. The city council collected the duty. 4 gold and 7 silver. Aldrich accepted the money in silence. He didn't thank them, but he didn't object either. Daniel counted it as a victory. A small one, but his first in the political arena. He spent the 15th and 16th days on Gregor, not on the army, on the man. Gregor was a good commander, but a poor administrator. He thought in terms of battle, attack, defense, order, execution. Daniel saw more in him. Gregor knew every one of his soldiers. He knew their families, their weaknesses, their strengths. He remembered who was wounded and who needed a day off. It was a natural talent for managing people, just without the language to describe it. Daniel began to teach him, not to order, but to explain, not to cut, but to plan. The first lesson was simple. Daniel asked Gregor to make a list of all the soldiers. Name, age, family, specialization, health status, strengths, weaknesses. Gregor grumbled. He said he knew all that in his head. Daniel replied that he had only one head, and if something happened to him, who would know that Private Thomas was the best marksman in the unit, but had a bad knee and couldn't go on a long march? Gregor fell silent. He sat down and began to write. He wrote slowly. The letters were crooked, but he wrote. Daniel sat beside him and helped with the wording. By evening, the list was ready. 42 people, 42 data sets. Gregor looked at the finished sheet and said quietly that it was like a map, only not of the terrain, but of people. Daniel nodded. He said that's exactly how it works, a map of people, and that a good commander must know both maps, of the land and of the people. On the 17th day, Daniel received a bundle of fine fabric from the system. Silk, real silk. In this region, silk was a luxury. It cost a fortune. But Daniel didn't sell it. He took the bundle to Sori. He asked her to find the best seamstress in town. Sori found one, an old woman named Gerda. Daniel ordered 6 silk scarves from her, embroidered. The symbol of Stonebrook, a tower and a wave. Gerda asked why. Daniel explained. Gifts, for the right people at the right time. A gift is not a bribe. A gift is the language of power. Gerda didn't understand, but she sewed them beautifully. Daniel put 5 of the scarves away. He gave one to Rolf before his next voyage. The old merchant unfolded the silk scarf embroidered with a tower and a wave and looked at Daniel with new eyes. Not as a trading partner, as someone greater. The 18th day. Lena brought news. She had overheard a conversation between 2 strangers at the market. They were asking about a stranger who commanded the garrison and traded in salt. The description matched Daniel. They weren't locals, well-dressed, armed. Lena didn't get close, but she remembered their faces. She described them to Daniel. He listened and felt a chill between his shoulder blades. Someone was interested in him. Someone from outside. He told Lena to be careful and not to approach strangers. Then he went to Gregor. He told him. Gregor wasn't surprised. He said that a stranger with money who's building up the town always attracts attention. The question is, whose? If it's the people of Ostrakamia, that means they're already looking towards Stonebrook. If it's the regent's people, then the capital has taken notice too. Both options are dangerous. Gregor suggested posting lookouts. Daniel agreed, but he added, don't touch them, just watch. Who they are, where they're staying, who they're talking to. Information is more important than safety. Gregor grimaced. For him, safety always comes first. But he listened. The strangers left 2 days later, quietly, at night, leaving no traces. Gregor checked the room in the tavern where they had been staying. Empty. Just a scratch on the windowsill. A symbol. Gregor recognized it. Black silk. A mercenary guild. The most dangerous in the region. They don't fight openly. They gather information, carry out orders, assassinations, kidnappings, blackmail. If Black Silk is interested in Daniel, it means someone has already paid for the reconnaissance. The next step will be an order. Daniel listened to this and was silent for a minute. Then he asked Gregor how much a contract killing through Black Silk would cost. Gregor answered, it depends on the target. For an ordinary person, 100 gold pieces. For a noble, 500. For a ruler, 1,000 or more. Daniel smirked. He said that for now, he was worth no more than 100. He needed to raise his price. Gregor didn't appreciate the humor, but he began doubling the security. The 20th day, the gift of the day, a thick book in a leather binding. Daniel opened it and discovered it was the history of Valmarsh, detailed, with genealogies, maps, descriptions of laws. He read it for 2 days, every spare moment, and the more he read, the clearer the picture became. Valmarsh wasn't always weak. 100 years ago, it was a thriving kingdom. Salt mining brought in gold. The fleet was strong. The army was sufficient. Then the decline began. Not because of wars, because of poor management. 3 generations of kings who spent more than they earned, who didn't invest in infrastructure, who handed out privileges to their favorites and stifled trade with taxes. A classic case. A company that lived off old contracts and failed to evolve. He had seen such ones in his past life. They all ended the same way. The 21st day became a turning point. In the morning, a carriage pulled up to the gates of Stonebrook. Old, but once luxurious. A coat of arms on the door, faded but recognizable. A woman stepped out of the carriage, tall, straight-backed, gray streaks in her chestnut hair, a stern yet beautiful face. Her clothes were simple but clean. She looked at the city gates as if she had returned home after a long absence. The guards at the gates saluted, not because they knew her, because her bearing left them any choice. Gregor recognized her first. He paled. He straightened up. He squared his shoulders and quietly told Daniel her name, Margaret Ashford, former lady-in-waiting to Queen Eleanor, chief steward of the court. The woman who had maintained what remained of order in Kronheim for 20 years while the regents dragged everything that wasn't nailed down out of the palace. Daniel asked why she was here. Gregor replied that he didn't know. But if Margaret Ashford had come to Stonebrook, it meant things had gotten really bad in the capital. Margaret didn't come to see Daniel. She stayed in the best room at the only decent hotel in town and sent a note an hour later. Ink, parchment, impeccable handwriting. She was requesting an audience, not with the city council, not with the garrison captain, with the stranger who had brought order to the city in 3 weeks. Daniel read the note 3 times. Then he showed it to Sori. Sori turned pale. She knew the name Margaret Ashford. Everyone did. She was the woman the ministers feared. Daniel dressed in his best, which meant the same as usual because he had nothing else. He took Sori with him to take notes and went to the meeting. Margaret sat by the window, back straight. Her hands were on her knees. Tea was on the table. 2 chairs faced her. She was waiting. Daniel entered. He sat down. Sori sat down next to him with a quill and parchment. Margaret looked at him for a minute without saying a word. She was studying him. He let her. He didn't look away. Then she spoke. Her voice was like that of a teacher addressing a class, steady, firm, with a note of familiar superiority. She said she had come to see him with her own eyes, that in Kronheim they were talking about the stranger in Stonebrook, that some considered him a charlatan, others an adventurer, still others a spy for Ostrokam. She wanted to understand who he really was. Daniel replied that he was no charlatan, no adventurer, and no spy, that he was a man without family or name, who knew how to count money and negotiate with people, and that Valmarsh was dying not from enemies, but from a lack of governance. Margaret listened. Her expression didn't change. Then she asked a question. She asked where he had learned all this. Daniel paused. Then he answered, "Far from here, in a place that no longer exists." Margaret looked at him for a long time, and she nodded, as if that answer satisfied her. Then she took an item wrapped in velvet out of her travel bag. She placed it on the table. She unwrapped it. Daniel looked. Sori gasped. On the velvet lay a medallion, bronze, with an inscription in a language Daniel didn't know, an exact copy of the one in his pocket. Margaret said it was the insignia of a royal advisor. There were 2 of them. One was worn by the advisor, the other was kept by the lady in waiting. 20 years ago, when Queen Eleanor died, the second medallion was lost. Margaret had kept hers all this time, waiting, without knowing what for. And then, 3 days ago, rumors reached her that a stranger with a bronze medallion had appeared in Stonebrook. She got into a carriage and went to check. Daniel slowly took his medallion out of his pocket. He placed it next to Margaret's medallion. They were identical. The same inscription, the same pattern, the same weight. Margaret looked at the 2 medallions lying side by side. Then she looked up at Daniel, and for the first time during their entire meeting, her expression changed. The sternness was gone. Something else remained. Hope. Old. Ailing. She was afraid. She rose from her chair, slowly, and sank to her knees. Sori jumped up. Daniel, too. He tried to help Margaret up. She didn't move. She said one sentence. She said she had been waiting 20 years. Daniel stood there, not knowing what to do. In his past life, the most difficult human moment at work had been when a secretary broke down in tears after being fired. Here, on her knees, stood a woman who had held on to a dead hope for 2 decades and suddenly saw that hope alive. He knelt down beside her. He put his hand on her shoulder. He said quietly that he didn't want her to be on her knees, that he needed her to stand up and help him. Because he had no idea how to run a kingdom, and he desperately needed someone who knew how the court worked. Margaret raised her head. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made him fall silent. Not admiration, not loyalty, recognition. As if she saw someone else in him, someone she remembered. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, wiped her eyes with one quick motion, and in a voice that had once again become hard as stone, she said that if he really was who she thought he was, then they needed to go to Kronheim immediately. Because in 9 days, the Regency Council would sign a treaty transferring Valmarsh to the Empire of Ostracom, and unless a king stepped in to veto the treaty, Valmarsh would cease to exist. They set out at dawn. Daniel, Margaret, Sori, Gregor with 10 of his best soldiers. Lena, too. Daniel tried to leave her in Stonebrook. She refused, silently. She just climbed onto the cart and sat down between the sacks of provisions. Gregor looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Lena. Lena looked at both of them with an expression that brooked no argument. They set off. Daniel left instructions for Baron, in writing, to continue trading, to keep an eye on the routes, to keep the books as Sori had taught him, to wait for news. Baron nodded. He shook Daniel's hand. He told him not to let himself get killed. Daniel replied that he would try. The journey to Kronheim took 5 days on horseback. They were traveling by wagon, so 7 days. They had 9 days until the treaty was signed. 2 days to spare. Margaret sat next to Daniel in the carriage and talked. A lot. Fast. To the point. She told him everything he needed to know about the capital, about the palace, about the regents, about the courtiers. 3 regents. Lord Houghton controls the treasury. Greedy, cautious, dangerous because he's smart. Lord Bertram controls the army, or rather what's left of it. Rough, straightforward, not dangerous in and of himself, but dangerous because of his unpredictability. Lady Annal controls the courts and the laws. Cunning, quiet, the most dangerous of the 3 because no one ever knows what she's thinking. All 3 want the throne. None can take it because the other 2 won't let them. A stalemate, which has lasted 6 months. And it is precisely this stalemate that gave Ostrocamny a chance. While the regents squabble, the Empire quietly prepares for annexation. The treaty has already been drafted. The terms are lenient on paper. Valmarsh retains formal autonomy, but the army is imperial. The treasury is imperial. The laws are imperial. The salt industry is coming under the control of the imperial monopoly. This isn't an annexation. It's a takeover. Slow. Quiet. Final. Daniel listened and pieced it all together in his head. 3 players at the table. Each one is blocking the other 2. An outside player is ready to take the pot. A classic game theory scenario. In such a situation, a 4th player is needed, one who will change the balance. On the 2nd day of the journey, the system's gift was unexpected. Day 23. A set of fine clothes, a dark blue doublet, trousers, boots, a cloak, all his size, all of good quality, not luxurious but decent. Margaret saw it and nodded approvingly. She said that one couldn't enter the palace in travel clothes. Daniel changed. He looked at himself in the small mirror that Margaret had taken out of her bag. He saw a stranger. Not Daniel Park from Seattle. Someone else. Someone who could pass for a minor nobleman from a distant province. He turned away from the mirror. He felt uneasy. Not because of the clothes, because of the feeling that he was playing a role, that this was all a performance, that he was an imposter. That feeling would return every morning, every time someone looked at him with hope. He buried it deep inside, just as he used to bury his anxiety before important negotiations in his past life. He smiled. He squared his shoulders. He walked on. On the 3rd day of their journey, they encountered refugees, a family, a man, a woman, 3 children. They were walking, their belongings on a makeshift stretcher, their faces gray with exhaustion. Gregor stopped the column. The man told their story. They were from a village east of Kronheim. Lord Bertram's soldiers had come last week. They took the grain, they took the livestock, they said it was a war levy, they paid nothing. Those who didn't give it up voluntarily were beaten. An old man died. The family gathered what they could and left. Anywhere, just far away. Daniel listened. His face was calm. His hands were empty. He clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He gave the family food from his supplies. He gave them silver. He pointed the way to Stonebrook. He said it was safe there, that there was work and shelter there. The man looked at him with the distrust of someone who had been deceived too often, but he took the silver, and he left. Daniel stood and watched them go. Margaret came over. She stood beside him. She was silent. Then she said quietly that it was like this all over Volmarch. The regents were plundering their own people to feed their soldiers. The soldiers were plundering the villages to feed themselves. The villages were emptying. There was no one to sow the seeds, no one to harvest the crops. By spring, famine will set in. If Ostrocommon doesn't take Valmarsh by force, he'll take it by starvation. Daniel nodded. He asked how many people had left the villages over the past 6 months. Margaret replied that she didn't know exactly, but tens of thousands, maybe more. Daniel closed his eyes. 200,000 souls, minus tens of thousands of refugees, minus ravaged villages, minus a collapsed economy, minus a hungry winter ahead. The numbers were terrifying. He opened his eyes. He looked at Margaret. He said they needed to hurry. Kronheim appeared on the horizon on the evening of the 5th day, sooner than they'd expected. Gregor had driven the carts along a good road for the last 2 days with almost no stops. The city was large. By Valmarsh standards, stone walls 3 men high, towers at the corners, a moat, a bridge, gates reinforced with iron. Above the gates, the Valmarsh banner, a silver wave on a blue field. The banner was dirty and tattered. No one had bothered to replace it. That told Daniel more about the state of the city than any report. Inside the walls, Kronheim looked like Stonebrook, only bigger and worse. The streets were dirtier. The people were poorer. Every other shop was closed. At the market, half the stalls were empty. The guard at the gate checked them superficially. Margaret showed her medallion. The guard turned pale. He stepped back. He let them through without asking any questions. Margaret explained quietly. The Hofmeisterin's medallion still served as a pass. The regents hadn't revoked it. Most likely, they'd forgotten it existed. Daniel smirked. The forgetfulness of those in power. The best friend of those who know the system. They didn't stop at the palace. Margaret led them to a house on a quiet street near the temple quarter. Her house. Small, stone, 2 stories. A garden behind a stone wall. Overgrown. But the roof was intact, and the walls were sturdy. She unlocked the door with a key she wore around her neck. Inside, it was dusty, cold, but clean. Someone had been looking after the house in her absence. Margaret lit the fireplace. She assigned everyone to their rooms. She ordered dinner. Her voice sounded different within these walls. Softer, more confident. She was home. That evening, the 4 of them sat down at the table. Daniel, Margaret, Sori, Gregor. Lena sat on the stairs and listened. Daniel didn't shoo her away. He had 4 days before the treaty was signed. 4 days to find a way to stop the annexation. Legally. Without an army. Without money. Without a name. He looked at his people. Gregor, 10 soldiers. Useless in the political arena. Margaret, knowledge of the court. Connections. Authority. But the regents don't trust her. Sori, numbers. Documents. A quick mind. But without a name or status. Lena, ears on the streets. But she's a child. Not enough. Still not enough. He asked Margaret what could stop the treaty from being signed. She replied, one thing, the law. The law of Valmarsh states, a territorial treaty may only be signed by the king or his direct heir. The Regency Council has the right to govern until the coronation of a new monarch, but it has no right to cede territory. The treaty with Ostrocommon is legally null and void. But no one will contest it, because there is no one to do so. There is no king. There is no heir. There is no legitimate figure who will stand up and declare the treaty invalid. The regents know this. Ostrocommon knows this. That is why they do not fear the law. A law without someone to enforce it is merely ink on parchment. Daniel listened and thought. The law exists. What is needed is someone who has the right to enforce it. A king, or an heir, or someone with the legitimate right to speak on behalf of the throne. He remembered the gifts from the system: 50 gold coins, a sack of salt, silver spoons, a rope, a writing set, a history book, a map, clothes, fabric, and a medallion, the Royal Advisor's Medallion. The system didn't give him weapons, didn't give him magic, didn't give him an army. It gave him tools, each time exactly the one he needed at that moment. A map when he began planning routes, a book when he needed history, clothes when he was traveling to court. The medallion. The medallion arrived on the 14th day. Back then, he didn't understand why. Now, he understood. The system knew he would meet Margaret. It knew the medallion would lead him to her. It knew she would lead him to Kronheim. This was no coincidence. It was logic. Someone else's calculating logic. And that thought sent a chill down his spine. Not from fear, from the realization that he was a pawn in someone else's game, and that the only way to stop being a pawn was to start playing the game himself. He asked Margaret to tell him about King Alberic's will. She frowned. She said there was no will. Alberic had died childless. No will had been found. Most likely, there hadn't been one, or it had been destroyed. The regents had searched the palace from top to bottom. Nothing. Daniel nodded. Then he asked something else. He asked where the royal archives were kept. Margaret looked at him. Her eyes narrowed. She replied that the archives were in the palace basement, 3 levels, thousands of documents. Security was minimal because no one cared about old papers. Daniel asked if she could take him there. Margaret was silent, for a long time. Then she asked what he hoped to find. Daniel answered honestly. He didn't know, but if the system had led him here, if the system had given him the medallion that led him to Margaret, if it was all part of a chain, then there was something in the archives he needed. He didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in patterns. Margaret looked at him, at his face, at his hands, at the medallion lying on the table between them. Then she nodded. She said that tomorrow morning she would take him to the palace, through a side entrance known only to the servants, through corridors even the rats had forgotten, to the archives where no one had gone since the king's death. The next morning, the 26th day, a gift from the system, a lantern that burns without oil. It just shines, with an even, warm light. It doesn't go out in the wind. It doesn't get hot. Daniel took it in his hand and snorted. Of course, a lantern for the basement. The system didn't even try to pretend it was a coincidence. Kronheim Palace was enormous. Gray stone, towers, passages, inner courtyards. But up close, it looked just like everything else in Valmarsh. Neglected, cracked walls. The moat had dried up. The garden was overgrown. The ground floor windows were boarded up. Margaret led them through the labyrinth of back corridors. She knew every turn, every staircase, every creaking floorboard. Daniel followed her. Sori followed him. Gregor stayed outside with the soldiers. A military detachment would have drawn attention in the palace. Lena had disappeared somewhere within the first 5 minutes. Daniel wasn't worried. Lena always came back, and always with information. They descended 3 levels. The staircase was stone, narrow, damp. A lantern illuminated the mold-covered walls. On the lowest level was a door, iron. The lock was rusty. Margaret had a key. It turned with a creak. The door opened. Behind it lay the archives. 3 halls, floor-to-ceiling shelves, scrolls, books, folders, bundles of documents tied with string, dust, cobwebs, the smell of old leather and damp stone. Daniel raised the lantern. Light flooded the first hall. He saw the scale of it and was momentarily taken aback. Thousands of documents, No catalog, no system, piled up haphazardly. Finding anything specific here was like searching for a single line in a database without a search function. Margaret said the archive hadn't been sorted through in 50 years. The last archivist died under the old king. No new one had been appointed. Daniel didn't start searching at random. He sat down on the floor. He took out a parchment and a quill and began to organize. The principle was the same as with any chaos. Break it down into sectors, define criteria, weeding out the unnecessary, narrow the search. He divided the hall into designated zones. He asked Sori to start with the right wall, to check every document. If it was a tax record or a trade agreement, set it aside. If it was correspondence or a decree, read the first lines and report back. Margaret worked on the left wall. She knew the old labeling system. Colored ribbons on the scrolls, red for royal decrees, blue for correspondence, green for finances. The system had long since fallen apart, but some ribbons remained. They worked for 5 hours. Daniel read the documents, one after another. His eyes ached from the small handwriting in the dim light, but he didn't stop. By the 4th hour, Sori found a chest, small, wooden, with a lock. It stood in the corner behind the shelves, buried under other boxes. Margaret looked at the chest and turned pale. There was a coat of arms on the lid. King Alberic's personal coat of arms, not the state one, his personal one. Daniel asked Margaret to open it. She didn't have a key. Gregor would have simply broken the lock, but Gregor wasn't there. Daniel took a knife out of his pocket, the very one Gregor had given him on the first day of patrol. He fiddled with the lock for 3 minutes. The lock clicked, not from skill, from rust. He opened the lid. Inside were papers, not many, 10 sheets. Letters, all written in the same handwriting, small, neat. Margaret took the first letter. She read it. Her hands were shaking. She said it was Alberic's handwriting, his personal notes, not official ones, private. He wrote them during the last year of his life, when he already knew he was sick, when he realized he would die without an heir. Daniel took the letters. He read them slowly. The language was more complex than spoken speech, old-fashioned, flowery, but understandable. Alberic wrote about Valmarsh, about his fears, about the regents he didn't trust, about Ostracom, who was waiting for his death like a vulture. And on the penultimate page, one sentence, which changed everything. Alberic wrote that he had drawn up a will, a secret one, sealed with a seal, and he had hidden it in the one place the regents would never think to search, in the chapel on the road to Stonebrook, the very chapel where his wife Eleanor loved to pray, the very chapel where Daniel Park had woken up 26 days ago. Margaret and Sori were looking at him. He was looking at the letter, the chapel. That very chapel, the place of his arrival. It couldn't be a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence. The system had dropped him right there, right where the will was hidden. And it gave him 26 days so he could reach this moment on his own, so he could find people, so he could build a team, so he could earn Margaret's trust, which would lead him to the archive. The whole chain, from day one. It was orchestrated by someone who could see 10 moves ahead. Daniel put the letters back in the chest. He turned to Margaret. He said they needed to go back to Stonebrook. Margaret turned even paler. She said they had 3 days before the contract was signed. That going back was madness. Daniel shook his head. He said they didn't need to go. They needed to send someone. Someone fast. Someone who knew the way. Someone he trusts. They climbed out of the basement, went out into the hallway, and there, sitting on the windowsill, was Lena, swinging her legs, chewing an apple, and waiting. Daniel looked at her. She looked at him. He asked if she could get to Stonebrook in less than 5 days. Lena stopped chewing. She thought for a moment. She replied that if he gave her a horse, she could make it in 3. She knew a shortcut through the hills, through the forest, the path that only locals use. Gregor would be against it. a child, alone, on horseback, through dangerous territory. Daniel knew that, but he had no choice. None of his soldiers knew the way. None of his men were faster than Lena. He crouched down in front of her, looked her in the eyes, explained what needed to be done. Ride to the chapel on the road to Stonebrook. Go inside. Find the hiding place. He didn't know where the hiding place was, but Lena would find it. She found everything. She nodded. Her eyes were serious. Not a trace of fear, only determination. Daniel handed her a purse of silver for the journey, a lantern for the chapel, and his knife, just in case. Lena hid everything under her cloak. She looked at him one more time. Then she turned and ran down the corridor, quickly, silently, like a shadow. Margaret stood nearby and said nothing. Then she whispered that he had sent a child. Daniel replied that he had sent the only person who was certain to return. Margaret looked at him and found nothing to say in reply. Now all that remained was to wait. 3 days. 3 days until the contract. 3 days until Lena. 3 days in a city full of people who wanted Valmarsh dead. The first day of waiting was the hardest. Daniel sat in Margaret's house and couldn't do anything. Just wait. He hated waiting. 8 years in logistics had taught him one rule. If you're waiting, you're not working. If you're not working, someone else is working against you. He stood up, got dressed, went into town. Margaret tried to stop him. She said they might recognize him, that the regents have eyes everywhere. Daniel replied that no one knows him by sight. He's a stranger, one of thousands. In a city full of refugees and vagrants, one more unfamiliar face means nothing. Margaret pressed her lips together, but she didn't argue. She was already beginning to understand that this man didn't listen when he'd made up his mind. He listened when he was thinking. And once he'd decided, he acted. Gregor went with him, no discussion. He just stood up and walked alongside him. 2 soldiers followed at a distance, not as guards, just watching. Kronheim looked even worse by day than it did at night. The market was open, but the prices were steep. Bread cost 3 times as much as in Stonebrook. Meat was a luxury. Salt was unaffordable for most. Shops were closing one after another. On the walls of the houses, someone had written words in chalk that Daniel didn't make out right away. The Sharpstone is coming. The king is gone. Run. He walked through the streets and counted. A habit. Closed shops. Empty counters. Beggars by the walls. Guards. Too many for a peaceful city. They stood in groups of 5. At every intersection. Different uniforms. 3 colors. 3 regents. Each kept his own squad in his own district. The city was divided. Not officially, but obviously. The northern quarter was controlled by Lord Houghton, the treasurer. It was cleaner and wealthier there. His guards wore yellow stripes. The eastern quarter belonged to Lord Bertram, the military man. There were more soldiers and fewer people there. Red stripes. The southern and western quarters were ruled by Lady Annelle, quiet, unobtrusive. Guards in gray, unremarkable faces. Daniel noticed them only because he was looking for them. The temple quarter where Margaret lived was neutral territory. The temples belonged to everyone and no one. The regents didn't touch the temples. Yet. Daniel spent 3 hours at the market. He talked to the merchants, bought small things. Bread, candles, thread. He paid generously, not with gold, with silver, with copper, without drawing attention. Between purchases, he asked questions, unobtrusively, like a curious traveler. The merchants were talkative. People need to talk in hard times. It's the only thing that's free. He learned a lot. The Ostrakomny embassy occupied an entire mansion in the northern quarter, guarded by Houghton's men. That meant Houghton had already made a deal with the Empire. Bertram hesitated. His soldiers were against annexation. They were used to serving Valmarch. The Imperial Army would render them unnecessary. Bertram understood he would lose power, but he feared war even more. Annelle remained silent, as always. No one knew what she wanted. Daniel was taking it all in, piecing together the pattern. Houghton for Ostracommon. Bertram is against it, but weak. Annelle is an unknown variable. In an equation with 3 variables, you need to fix at least one. That evening, he returned to Margaret's house. Sori met him with news. She had spent the day at the palace. Margaret had arranged for her to work as her assistant. Old connections still held sway. The servants remembered Mrs. Ashford. Doors opened, Sori entered the Regency Council's office, officially to check old records at Margaret's request, in reality to see the documents regarding the treaty with Ostracommon. She saw them. Not the treaty itself, a draft, on the secretary's desk. 5 minutes of reading while the secretary went to get tea. 5 minutes were enough. Sori summarized the contents. The terms were worse than Margaret had described. Valmarsh wasn't just losing its sovereignty. Valmarsh was handing over the salt mine to the Empire in lieu of debt. Forever. All trade duties would come under Imperial control. Valmarsh's army would be disbanded. An Imperial garrison would take its place. The regents would receive lifetime pensions and titles within the Imperial hierarchy. Golden cages. Beautiful, but cages. Daniel listened. Sori spoke quickly. She chewed on the pen she habitually held in her hand. Her eyes burned. She was angry. Quiet. Cold. Mathematically angry. She said the numbers didn't add up. That Valmarsh's debt to Ostracommon was twice as high as it should be. That the interest had been calculated in violation of the Empire's own laws. That if you recalculated the actual debt, it amounted not to 200,000 gold pieces, but to about 120. And that even 120,000 could be restructured over 20 years at a normal rate. Daniel looked at her. He asked if she could prove it, with documentation, with figures. Sori replied that she had already started. She needed a day, and access to the trade registers for the past 5 years. Margaret said the registers were in the archives. They would be brought down tomorrow morning. The second day of waiting. A gift from the system. A notary's seal. Small, bronze, with the symbol of scales. Daniel turned it over in his hands and sat down on the bed. A notary's seal. For certifying documents. The system knew he would need to certify something. Something important. Something that required an official seal. He put it in his pocket next to the medallion. 2 artifacts of power. Small ones. But in this world where the written word has the force of an oath, a small bronze circle could be worth more than an army. In the morning, Sori and Margaret went down to the archives. Daniel stayed upstairs. He had another task. He had to see Bertram. Not Houghton, who had already sold out. Not Annelle, who was a wild card. Bertram. Because Bertram was the weak link. Not in a bad way, in a managerial sense. He was a man who didn't want what was happening, but he saw no alternative. Daniel knew how to work with people like that. At his last job, half his negotiations started with a supplier saying he had no choice. There was always a choice. You just had to show it. Gregor set up a meeting, not directly, through a sergeant he knew in Bertram's unit. Old connections. Army brotherhood. It works everywhere and always. The sergeant relayed that a certain advisor from the provinces wanted to discuss defense matters with Lord Bertram. Bertram agreed. Not because he was interested, because he was bored. A regent without real power. A soldier without a war. A man who was used to taking action and had been forced to wait. Daniel understood him. The meeting took place at the tavern by the eastern gate. Neutral territory. Bertram arrived with 2 bodyguards. A large man, broad-shouldered, a weather-beaten face, hands covered in scars, tired eyes. He sat down across from Daniel and ordered a beer right away. Daniel ordered the same. Bertram looked at him and waited. Daniel spoke up. Not about the treaty, not about politics, about the soldiers. He asked Bertram how many men he had under his command. Bertram answered, 400. There used to be 800. Half had deserted or gone over to the bandits. Daniel asked when they'd last been paid their full pay. Bertram grunted, 5 months. Daniel asked what the soldiers ate. Bertram's face darkened. By requisitioning supplies from the villages, he knew it was looting. But he saw no other way out. People were starving. Soldiers were people too. Daniel nodded. He didn't judge him. He didn't lecture. He asked the next question. What would happen to Bertram's 400 soldiers after the treaty was signed? Bertram fell silent for a long time. He finished his beer, ordered another. Then he answered. Disbandment. The imperial garrison would arrive. His men would become nobodies. Some would join the bandits. Some would drink themselves to death. Some would die in the winter. He himself would receive a pension and a title, a beautiful cage, just as Sori had described. Daniel asked if that suited him. Bertram looked at him heavily. He replied that it did not. But the alternative was war with Ostrocommon, and war meant death for everyone. Because Valmarsh had neither an army, nor money, nor a king to wage that war. Daniel leaned forward. He said quietly that war wasn't the only alternative. Bertram raised an eyebrow. Daniel said there was a third way, not to surrender and not to fight, to negotiate. But for that, they needed someone with the authority to speak on behalf of Valmarsh. Bertram asked who. Daniel replied that he didn't know yet, but he asked Bertram for one thing, not to sign the treaty. 3 days, just 3 days. If Daniel didn't have a decision in 3 days, Bertram could sign. Bertram looked at him for a long time. Then he asked why he should trust a stranger. Daniel took a medallion out of his pocket. He placed it on the table. Bertram looked at the medallion. His expression changed. He recognized the symbol, Royal Advisor. He looked up at Daniel. Daniel held his gaze. Bertram took the medallion. He turned it over in his hand. He weighed it. Then he put it back. He said 3 days wasn't enough, but he would wait. Not for Daniel's sake, for his people's sake, because they had nothing to lose anyway. Daniel returned to Margaret's house by evening. Sori was already there, with papers. She had been working all day and all the previous night, dark circles under her eyes. Her hands were covered in ink, but her eyes were burning. She laid out 4 sheets of paper on the table, columns of numbers on each one. She had recalculated Valmarsh's debt to Ostrocommon. She had taken all the available trade registers. She had cross-checked them with the treasury records. She found 12 expense items that had been recorded twice. She found 3 large payments that Valmarsh had already made, but which had not been credited against the debt. She found an interest rate that violated inter-royal agreements. The result? The actual debt was not 200,000 gold pieces, but 118. And even that amount could be disputed, because part of the debt arose from imperial trade restrictions that themselves violated the Treaty of the Seven Crowns. Daniel looked at the numbers and felt that familiar professional thrill. Like in negotiations, when you know the other party is in a weak position and they don't know it. He asked Sori to compile everything into a single document. Clean, clear, with references to sources, like a financial report. Sori nodded and sat down to work. Margaret brought her tea. Daniel noticed this gesture. Margaret never brought tea to anyone. She was used to having tea brought to her, but she brought it to Sori, herself, without saying a word. And Daniel realized that these 2 women had found each other, the old custodian and the young accountant. 2 sides of the same coin, order and precision. The 3rd day of waiting, the last. Tomorrow the contract is signed. Lena isn't here. Daniel stood by the window and looked out at the street. It was raining. Lightly. Coldly. Autumnal. Winter is coming. His first winter in this world. If Lena doesn't return. If there is no will. If the chapel is empty. Then what? He ran through the possibilities. Without a will, he is nobody, a stranger with a medallion. The medallion gives him the right to speak, but not the right to command. An advisor is not a king. An advisor is a shadow behind the throne, and the throne is empty. He could go for a bluff, declare rights he doesn't have. But in a world where a signature on parchment holds the power of an oath, the bluff would be exposed. And then it would be over. Not just for him, for everyone around him. For Margaret, who believed for the first time in 20 years. For Sori, who for the first time in 3 years isn't crying at night. For Gregor, who for the first time in 6 months feels he is serving a purpose. For Lena, who is now alone on the road in the dark and the rain. He has no right to lose, not for himself, for them. Noon. A knock at the door. Gregor opened it. A boy of about 10 stood on the threshold, wet, dirty, out of breath. He brought a note. Daniel unfolded it. 3 words, clumsy handwriting, crooked letters. Found it. Coming. Lena. Daniel read the note, read it again, sat down. The note trembled in his hand. Margaret asked what had happened. Daniel answered with 1 word. Coming. Margaret closed her eyes. Sori dropped her pen. Gregor swore in relief. Daniel stood up. Time to work. Less than a day left. Lena would be there by evening or night. The signing was tomorrow morning. That meant 1 night to prepare. He gathered everyone around the table. Margaret, Sori, Gregor. He laid out the plan. Not on paper, in his head. He spoke slowly, clearly, as if at a meeting. Point 1. The will must be verified and confirmed. Margaret will confirm Alberic's handwriting and seal. She knew them better than anyone. Point 2. The debt document. Sori will present it as proof that the terms of the agreement with Osterkamen are based on falsified figures. Point 3. Bertram. He must refuse to sign, publicly, in front of the Osterkamen envoys. This will cause a rift in the Regency Council. Houghton won't be able to sign it alone. He needs at least 2 out of 3 votes. Point 4. Annel, the unknown. Daniel paused. Then he looked at Margaret. He asked what she knew about Annel. Margaret thought for a moment. She answered slowly. Annel is smart, cautious, not greedy, unlike Houghton, not impulsive, unlike Bertram. She's a lawyer, a legal expert. Procedure is important to her. She'll only sign the contract if it's legally flawless. Daniel smiled, for the first time in 3 days. A lawyer, a stickler for procedure. So if a legal obstacle arises, heir, will, law. Annel won't sign, not out of loyalty, out of principle. She'd rather block the contract and demand new hearings than put her signature on a document that could be contested. Margaret listened and nodded slowly. She was beginning to see the picture. Gregor, too, even he, a man of the sword. He saw that this wasn't a fight, it was an operation, and that each of them was a link in the chain. At midnight, the panel flashed. Day 30, gift of the day, King Alberic's certified will. On the table lay a scroll that hadn't been there a second ago, the royal seal, a signature. Margaret read over his shoulder. She turned pale. The will transferred the crown to whoever presented both of the advisor's medallions and was recognized as the Oberhofmeisterin. Not blood, recognition. Margaret had already recognized him, 21 days ago in Staunbrook. Daniel felt the weight, not of the parchment, 200,000 souls. He said 1 word. All right. The door flew open. Lena stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, her cloak torn. 3 days on horseback through rain and forest. 13 years. Alone. But in her hands, a dry bundle. The second copy of the will from the chapel. Identical. 2 documents. 1 from the system, 1 real. Daniel dropped to his knees and hugged her, not for the document, for coming back alive. Lena clung to him and stood there like that. Then she sniffed and said the horse was limping and they needed to pay the stable hand. Daniel laughed for the first time in a month. In the morning, they entered the palace, 4 of them: Daniel, Margaret, Sori, Gregor. Their weapons remained outside. Today, their weapons were paper. The throne room, neglected, the throne covered with gray cloth. At the table sat 3 regents: Houghton, pale and greedy; Bertram, stony and silent; Annel, gray and ruthless. Beside them stood the ambassador from Ostrocomnia, calm, confident, a man who had come to claim his prize. On the table lay the annexation treaty. Margaret demanded the right of appeal, an ancient law. Annel accepted. Daniel stepped forward and announced that he was presenting the king's will. He placed both scrolls on the table. Margaret confirmed their authenticity. Annel read for 3 minutes. She looked up. She said one sentence: "The document complies with the laws." Houghton shouted that it was a forgery. Annel repeated, "The document complies. Until the examination is complete, the signing of the territorial treaty is suspended. The law." Then Daniel made his second move. He nodded to Sori. She stepped forward, petite, in a mended dress, with a folder of figures, and she laid out Valmarsh's debt. Double entries, unrecorded payments, inflated interest rates. The actual debt is not 200,000, but 118. The terms of the agreement are based on forgery. The ambassador listened. His face twitched for the first time. Annel announced that the signing was postponed. Bertram agreed. 2 votes against 1. The ambassador bowed and left, clenching his jaw. He'd lost this round, but he was already thinking about the next one. The examination took a week. 3 experts unanimously confirmed the authenticity. While they were working, Daniel was working too. He offered Bertram a contract. 400 soldiers would become guards for the trade routes. Payment would come from customs duties. Daniel would pay for the first month himself. Bertram said he was either a madman or a genius. Daniel replied that in his experience, the two were often one and the same. Bertram smiled for the first time. Meanwhile, through her old connections at the court of Sori, Margaret obtained Houghton's shadow accounts. He had been receiving bribes from Ostrocomnia for 3 years, until Alberic's death, until the start of the debt crisis. He didn't take advantage of the situation, he created it. He inflated expenses. He signed unfavorable contracts. He was killing the kingdom from within. Daniel read it, folded the papers, put them away. A trump card. The time to use it hadn't come yet. On the 5th day of the audit, an unexpected guest came to see Daniel. He was sitting in Margaret's office, working on a debt restructuring plan, when the door opened. Margaret ushered the woman in. Short, gray eyes, a gray dress. Lady Annel. No security. Alone. She had come to Margaret's house as a private individual, not as regent. Daniel stood up, offered a chair. Margaret brought tea. Annel sat down. She looked at Daniel, silently, for a minute, 2. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, steady, emotionless. She said that the expert analysis would confirm the will's authenticity. That much was already clear. She said that Houghton was preparing a counterattack. He planned to announce that the will had been drawn up when Albrecht was already ill and of unsound mind. That would provide grounds to contest the document. The trial could last months, years. Ostrocomnia would have time, and in that time, he would finish off Valmarsh. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. Then he asked why she was telling him this. Annel paused. Then she answered. She said that Houghton was a traitor, that she had known it for a long time, that she couldn't prove it, that she had been waiting. Daniel understood. Annel wasn't Houghton's ally. She wasn't anyone's ally. She was a judge who had been waiting for evidence. And now that a stranger with a medallion had entered the throne room and placed papers on the table, she saw an opportunity. Not for Daniel, for the law, for order, for the system to finally work as it should. Daniel took out Sori's folder. He placed it in front of Anel. Houghton's bills, bribes from Ostrocam, falsified expenses, everything. Anel read. For a long time, her face remained unchanged, but her hands trembled slightly. When she finished, she looked up. For the first time all evening, Daniel saw emotion in her eyes. Anger, quiet, deep, controlled. She asked if he had the originals. Sori replied that some of the documents were in the archives, some were in the office. Everything could be checked and confirmed. Anel nodded. She stood up, thanked them for the tea, left. Margaret closed the door behind her, turned to Daniel, asked if he trusted Anel. Daniel replied that he didn't trust her, but he understood. And understanding is more reliable than trust. The 7th day. The results of the examination. Official. In the throne room. 3 experts. Unanimously. The will is genuine. Written in King Albrecht's hand. The seal matches. The parchment matches. The wording matches. Houghton demanded the floor. He began speaking about the king's state of mind at the time of writing. Anel interrupted him. She stood up and read a statement. She accused Lord Houghton of treason, of accepting bribes from a foreign state, of deliberately undermining the economy of Valmarsh, with evidence, with figures, with documents. The room fell silent. Houghton turned pale. Then he flushed. Then he tried to leave. Bertram's soldiers stood at the door, 4 of them. They didn't move. Bertram sat at the table and looked at Houghton expressionlessly. Houghton turned to the Austro-Camian ambassador. The ambassador looked away. A professional. The agent had been caught. No connection. Houghton was led away, quietly. No shouting, no scenes. He walked between the soldiers and said nothing. Daniel watched him go and felt no joy, only exhaustion, and the realization that this was only the beginning. Anel turned to Daniel. She said that the Regent's Council now consisted of 2 people. A minimum of 2 votes was needed to make decisions. Her and Bertram. She proposed a vote on the matter of recognizing the will. Bertram voted in favor. Anel voted in favor. Unanimous. The will is recognized. The Regency Council dissolves itself. The crown is transferred in accordance with the will of the late king, to the person who presented both the advisor's medallions and was recognized as the Oberhofmeisterin. Margaret stepped forward. She stood before Daniel. She looked him in the eyes, for a long time. Then she dropped to one knee, and recited the formula she had memorized 20 years ago, the words of the oath, of acknowledgement, of loyalty. Daniel stood and felt the ground slipping from under his feet. Not from nervousness, from the magnitude of it all. Margaret stood up. She turned to face the hall, and announced in a voice that did not waver for a moment. Daniel Park, King of Valmarsh. There were 23 people in the hall. Daniel counted them. 3 experts, Anel, Bertram, Margaret, Sori, Gregor. 10 courtiers and secretaries, 4 guards, and Lena, who had somehow ended up on the 2nd floor gallery, sitting on the railing with her legs dangling. 23 people at the coronation, without a crown, no robe, no fanfare. Daniel stood before the empty throne in the blue doublet the system had given him, and looked at the people who had become his subjects. Then he turned toward the throne. He removed the gray cloth. Beneath it was an old chair, wooden, carved, worn. He didn't sit in it. He stood nearby and said nothing. Then he spoke, quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. He said the throne would have to wait, work first, then the ceremonies. Gregor, in the corner of the hall, smiled for the first time in a month, broadly, genuinely. The first days after the coronation were chaos. The fancy word for it was transition period. The real word was mess. Daniel sat in the former regent's office and sorted through papers. There was a sea of them: debts, complaints, petitions, lawsuits, trade disputes, land claims. Everything that had piled up for a while the regent squabbled instead of governing. He worked 16 hours a day. Sori by his side, Margaret by his side. Gregor at the door, Lena shuttling between floors with notes and errands. He set up a system within the first week. Not perfect, but functional. He divided all matters into 3 categories: urgent, important, everything else. He handled the urgent ones himself. He delegated the important ones. He put off everything else. The locals didn't understand this. To them, every matter was urgent and important and required the king's personal attention. Daniel explained, patiently, over and over again, if everything is urgent, then nothing is urgent. Setting priorities isn't ignoring problems. It's solving them in the right order. The courtiers listened and nodded and didn't understand a thing, but they obeyed. Because the system worked, matters were resolved. Slowly, but they were resolved. The first week, food. Kronheim was starving. Not literally, but close. Winter supplies were meager. The market was half empty. Prices were rising every day. Daniel applied the same approach he'd used in Stonebrook. He found suppliers. He negotiated prices. He organized delivery. But the scale was different. Stonebrook had 3,000 people. Kronheim had 30,000. One person couldn't handle it alone. He needed people. He started looking. Not nobles, not officials, workers, people who know how to get things done. Baron arrived from Stonebrook in the second week. He brought goods. He brought news. Trade is moving. Patrols on the roads. Rolf has set up regular trips along the coast. Daniel appointed Baron as the capital's food supply coordinator. Baron turned pale. He said he was just a merchant, not an official. Daniel replied that the difference between a merchant and an official is that a merchant knows how to count money, while an official knows how to spend it. He needed someone who could count. Baron accepted the position. 3 days later, the first carts loaded with fish and grain arrived from the coastal villages. Market prices shifted. Slightly, but they shifted. The second week, the army. Bertram fulfilled his part of the agreement. 300 of the 400 soldiers came under royal command. 100 left. They didn't want to serve a stranger. Daniel didn't try to hold them back. A soldier recruited by force is worse than an enemy. 300 men, plus 42 from Stonebrook. 342 soldiers. By comparison, the Empire of Sharpstone could field 10,000. The math wasn't in his favor. But Daniel wasn't planning to fight. He was planning to guard. The difference was fundamental. War requires an army. Guarding requires organization. He divided the soldiers into squads of 20. Each squad had a route. Each route had a schedule. For every schedule, a report. Gregor grumbled about the reports, but he filed them because he saw the results. During the first 2 weeks of patrolling, 3 bandit groups dispersed on their own. Without a fight, they simply moved further east, toward the pass, toward Ostrakamny. So be it. The main thing is that the roads are starting to clear up. The third week, finances. Sori presented a full audit of the royal treasury. The result was catastrophic. The treasury was empty. Literally, Houghton had cleaned it out. The debt to Ostrakamny was 118,000, according to actual calculations. Current expenses for maintaining the court and the army, 4,000 gold pieces a month. Revenue, 0. Because taxes hadn't been collected for 6 months. Trade duties weren't coming in. The salt mine was operating at minimum capacity, and the profits were disappearing into thin air. Daniel looked at the numbers and saw a familiar picture. A company after a hostile takeover. Assets drained. Debts at their peak. Operations paralyzed. In his previous life, such companies went bankrupt. Here, bankruptcy was not an option. People lived here. He drew up a plan, not for salvation, for stabilization. The first step, cut the court's expenses in half. Margaret helped. She knew every expense item, the upkeep of empty halls, salaries for courtiers who didn't work, Food purchases at inflated prices through Houghton's suppliers. Daniel cut ruthlessly. Not people, expenses. He met personally with every courtier who was dismissed. He explained. He offered them other jobs. Not everyone agreed, but no one left feeling wronged. Or almost no one. Step 2. Secure revenue. Trade duties. Barons set up collection points on 3 roads and at the port. Fair rates, transparent accounting, every penny recorded. Step 3. The salt mine. Velmarsh's main asset. Daniel sent Sori there to investigate. She returned 4 days later with a report, and the look of someone who had witnessed a fire in a library. The mine was in terrible condition. The equipment was old. The shafts were partially flooded. There were half as many workers as needed. The manager was stealing. Production was at 20% of its potential. Sori laid everything out, point by point, clearly, with figures. Daniel listened and nodded. Then he asked what was needed to raise output to at least 60%. Sori replied, "A new manager, equipment repairs, hiring workers, a drainage system for the flooded shafts. Total cost, 200 gold pieces for the first phase." Daniel looked at the treasury balance sheet. 200 gold pieces that weren't there. He sat at the table and thought, for a long time. Then he remembered. Bonds. An idea he'd been mulling over back in Stonebrook, to give people the opportunity to lend money to the king, at interest, with a guarantee of repayment from the mine's future revenues. In his world, this was called government bonds. Here, such a thing didn't exist. He explained the idea to Sori. She listened. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. She began to calculate. If the rate is 5% per year, if the term is 3 years, if the mine's income grows to the projected level, then repayment is guaranteed, with a profit for investors. Daniel nodded. He asked who in Kronheim had 200 gold pieces of spare cash. Sori answered without hesitation. Merchants, jewelers, the temple, and one man, Rolf, an old cloth merchant who had already made his fortune on the shipping line and whose capital was growing. Daniel smiled. I need to write to Rolf. The 4th week. The system's gifts kept coming, every night. A sack of grain, a set of tools, 3 blankets made of excellent wool, a barrel of honey. Nothing spectacular, all useful. Daniel noticed a pattern. The gifts were timely. When he was working on food supplies, the system provided food. When he was working on the army, the system provided a weapons repair kit. When he sat down to calculate the budget, the system provided silver bars. It responded to his actions. It amplified them. It didn't solve problems for him, but it helped. Like an assistant who brings coffee and the right document at just the right moment. Someone was watching. Someone saw what he was doing and approved. The thought was both comforting and frightening. On the 28th day of his reign, the first assassination attempt took place. Night. Daniel was working in his office, alone. Sori had gone to bed 2 hours ago. He'd sent her away because she'd fallen asleep over the numbers. Margaret had left too. Gregor was standing behind the door, as always. Daniel was writing a letter to Rolf about the bonds when he heard a sound. Quiet. Strange. As if someone had run a fingernail across the glass. He looked up. The window. A shadow behind the glass. Quick! He didn't have time to stand up. Gregor burst into the room first, with some kind of animal instinct. He grabbed Daniel by the collar and yanked him from the chair. In that very second, the window shattered. A crossbow bolt pierced the back of the chair, exactly where Daniel's head had been a second ago. Gregor threw him to the floor, covered him with his own body, yelled a command. Soldiers rushed into the room, 2 to the window, 2 to the door. Gregor stood up. He drew his sword. He leaned out the window. Darkness. Rain. No one. The archer was gone. Professional. Gregor turned to Daniel. He was sitting on the floor, staring at the bolt in the chair. His hands weren't shaking. Strange. He'd expected them to tremble. But no, a cold calm. Like that night on the side of the road when he saw the truck's headlights. 1 second between life and death. He'd been through this before. Gregor reached out, lifted him up, looked him in the eyes, said that starting tomorrow, Daniel wouldn't be working by the window. Daniel nodded. Then he looked at the bolt. There was a mark on it, small, black. A silk thread wrapped around the shaft. Black silk. The guild had sent its assassin. Someone had put a price on his head. Houghton from under arrest, or Ostrocommon, or a third party. Daniel carefully pulled the bolt out of the chair. He placed it on the table. He looked at it. Then he looked at Gregor. He said he needed intelligence. Not patrols, not guards, intelligence. People who know how to work in the shadows. Find those who are hiding. Gregor replied that he knew one person, but that person wouldn't work for the king. Daniel asked who. Gregor paused. Then he answered, the captain of Black Silk, the one sent to kill him. She's still in the city, waiting. Daniel raised an eyebrow. He asked how Gregor knew. Gregor replied that his men had been watching her for a week. She knows. She isn't leaving. She's waiting. For what? It's unclear. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he nodded. He said, arrange a meeting. The meeting took place the next day, in a tavern, neutral territory. Daniel came without guards. Gregor was against it, vehemently. Daniel insisted. If he came with soldiers, there would be no conversation. There would be an interrogation. And an interrogation isn't a negotiation. She sat in the corner, dark hair, a scar across her eyebrow, her left hand on the table, her right hand under the table, a mug of beer she wasn't drinking. Eyes like a cat's, attentive, calm, ready. Daniel sat across from her. He ordered 2 mugs, one for her, one for himself. He was silent for a minute. She was silent too. Then he spoke. Not about the assassination attempt, not about the guild. He asked how much they were paying her for his head. She answered, 200 gold pieces. He nodded, asked a second question, why she had joined the mercenaries. She was silent for a long time. Then she answered, briefly, 3 words, village, soldiers, fire. Daniel understood. He'd seen refugees on the road. He'd seen villages from which everyone had fled. He'd seen people with nowhere to go. She was one of them. Only she had chosen not to run. She had chosen to become dangerous, so that what had happened to her village would never happen to her again. He didn't feel sorry for her. Pity is an insult to a person like that. He made an offer. 1,000 gold pieces a year, command of the new Royal Intelligence Unit, the right to choose her own missions, the right to say no. She raised an eyebrow. The scar twitched. She asked why she would need that. Daniel answered, because for 200 gold pieces, she kills for people she hates. For 1,000, she'll protect those who deserve it. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said he didn't have 1,000. He replied that he would. She asked how he knew. He replied that it was his job to know what will be. She was silent. Then she took a sip of beer, her first, and she told him her name, Isla Vesper. Daniel held out his hand. She looked at his hand, free of calluses from a sword, the hand of a man who had never fought, and she shook it, firmly, like a person who had made a decision and had no intention of changing it. The second month of his reign began with diplomacy. Daniel understood that Valmarch would not survive in isolation. 342 soldiers against 10,000, an economy that had only just begun to breathe, debt hanging over them like a sword. He needed allies, not friends, partners, people and states that stood to gain from Valmarch's existence. In his past life, this was called a strategic partnership. Here, it was called diplomacy. A difference in terminology. The essence is the same. Find what the other side needs and offer it in exchange for what you need. First target, the Kingdom of Halegrave. Eastern neighbor. Stronger than Valmarsh, weaker than Ostrocam. Neutral. For now. Margaret explained the situation. Halegrave was ruled by King Devault. Old. Cautious. He has 4 children, an eldest son, 2 middle sons in military service, a youngest daughter, Princess Yvonne, 22 years old, unmarried. Daniel listened and understood where Margaret was going. A dynastic marriage. Classic. But he didn't reject the idea right away. Not because he wanted a marriage of convenience. Because he knew the rule. Don't give up on a tool until you understand how it works. He assembled a diplomatic mission. Margaret led it. She knew the protocols. She knew the people at the court of Halegrave. She knew how to dress, what to say, and where to bow. Daniel wrote a letter to King Devault, personally, on fine parchment, with a sorry quill, because Daniel's handwriting was still shaky. The content was unusual. He wasn't asking for help. He wasn't asking for an alliance. He was proposing a trade agreement. Salt from Valmarsh at a fixed price, lower than the imperial rate. For Halegrave, this meant savings of thousands of gold pieces a year. In exchange, Daniel asked for one thing: recognition of his legitimacy. An official letter from King Devault confirming that Halegrave recognized Valmarsh's new monarch. This was more important than money, more important than an army. Recognition from one of the 7 kingdoms, a precedent. If Halegrave recognizes him, then Sharpstone cannot declare Daniel an imposter, not without a war with Halegrave. Margaret left. She took an escort with her. Gregor assigned 20 of his best soldiers, all in the new uniforms that Daniel ordered with money from the first trade duties, blue with silver. The colors of Valmarsh. A tower and a wave on the insignia. A small detail, but Margaret approved. She said that the uniform is the face of the state. If the soldiers look like ragged beggars, then the state looks like a beggar too. Daniel agreed. Marketing works everywhere, even in the Middle Ages. While Margaret was on her way, Daniel taken care of internal affairs, the mine, the bonds. He held a meeting with the 6 largest merchants of Kronheim, in the throne room, at a large table, not on the throne, at the table, as equals. The merchants were wary. A new king, an outsider, no lineage, no name. What did he want? Money. Of course money. All kings want money. Daniel surprised them. He didn't ask for money. He proposed an investment. He pulled out the documents. Sori had prepared a presentation, not on slides, on parchment. But the principle was the same. Problem, solution, numbers, result. The mine is operating at 20% capacity. 200 gold pieces are needed for repairs and hiring. In 6 months, output will rise to 60%. The mine's revenue will cover the return on investment plus interest. 5% per annum, guaranteed. The royal seal, a signed document, with a notary seal provided by the system. The merchants listened. They exchanged glances. They whispered. One of them, an old man named Master Galen, asked why he should believe the mine would become profitable. Daniel replied, he didn't have to believe, he had to calculate, and he handed him Sori's report. Galen read it, at length. Then he looked at Sori, at the small, quiet girl with a feather in her hair. He asked who she was. Daniel answered, Valmarsh's chief treasurer. Galen raised an eyebrow. He looked at Daniel, then at Sori, then back at Daniel, and said that this was the first time he'd seen a treasurer who knew how to count. Daniel didn't tell him that this was an insult to all the previous treasurers. He just nodded. By the end of the meeting, 4 of the 6 merchants agreed. 160 gold pieces, not 200, but close. Daniel covered the missing 40 from his own funds, the money he'd earned in Stonebrook, and the profits from the system. Valmarsh bonds were issued, the first in the history of this world. Sori drew up each one, beautifully, neatly, with a number, with a date, with a seal. The merchants looked at the papers with the expression of people who weren't sure whether they'd received a treasure or pretty trash. Time will tell. The mine received the money. Daniel sent a new manager there, not a bureaucrat, a senior foreman from the mine itself. A man named Torvald who had been going down into the mine for 20 years and knew every tunnel. Torvald didn't want to be the manager. He said he was a miner, not a clerk. Daniel replied that a manager isn't a clerk. A manager is a miner who stands above and thinks for those below. Torvald thought it over. He agreed, on one condition, that Daniel wouldn't meddle in the miners' affairs. Daniel promised, on one condition, that Torvald send a monthly report on production and expenses. Torvald grimaced, but he agreed. Sori went with him for the first week, to set up the books, to teach him how to keep track. Daniel let her go with a heavy heart. Without Sori by his side, he felt like he was missing his right hand. But delegation is a matter of trust, and trust cannot be feigned. The third week of the second month, Margaret returned from Halegrave with news. King Devault had accepted the trade proposal, salt at a fixed price. Halegrave had recognized Daniel as the legitimate monarch, an official letter bearing the royal seal. Daniel unfolded it and read it. He reread it. He placed it carefully on the table. It was more than recognition. It was a weapon, a political one, more powerful than any sword. Now Ostrocommon could not simply declare him an impostor. Now the annexation of Valmarsh meant conflict with Bluck, a small step, but the first. Margaret had brought something else, or rather, someone. Princess Yvonne Ashhelm, 22 years old, Devault's youngest daughter, sent to the court of Valmarsh as a diplomatic observer. Margaret said this in a neutral tone. Daniel heard a warning behind the neutrality. A diplomatic observer is a spy, and a potential bride, 2 in 1. Yvonne arrived with her own escort, 10 people, 3 maids, 2 secretaries, 5 guards. She entered the throne room, and Daniel saw her for the first time. Fair-haired, tall, upright posture. Her face was beautiful and cold. Her eyes were gray-blue, intelligent, appraising. She looked around the throne room, at the cracks in the ceiling, at the empty throne, at Daniel in his blue doublet without a crown, and something flashed across her face. Not disappointment, curiosity. The first meeting was formal. Margaret introduced them. Titles, protocols, bows. Yvonne performed everything flawlessly. Then she sat down across from Daniel across the table. And she spoke. A pleasant voice, sharp words. She said she'd heard a lot about the new king of Valmarsh, that they tell interesting stories in Halegrave. A stranger with no lineage, crowned in a half-empty hall, who pays his soldiers on time and counts money better than merchants. She asked if it was true that he had invented a new way of keeping the books. Daniel replied that he hadn't invented it. He had simply applied what works. Yvonne smiled, a sharp smile. She said that modesty is a fine quality for a king, especially for a king whose treasury is empty. Daniel wasn't offended. He recognized the tactic, provocation, a test. She wanted to see how he'd react to the jab. He answered, calmly, with numbers. The treasury isn't empty. The treasury is in the process of being filled. He explained the structure, trade duties, the mine, bonds, the shipping line. Yvonne listened. Her eyes shifted, from mocking to focused. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she made a comment about the budget. 1. Precise. She said that his calculation of the mine's revenue did not account for the seasonality of production. In winter, the mines partially close flooding. That means revenue will be 20% lower than projected during the winter months. Daniel paused. He looked at her. She was right. He hadn't accounted for seasonality because he didn't know about it. He was a manager from Seattle, not a mining engineer. He looked at Yvonne, at her gray-blue eyes, and asked for her opinion on the entire fiscal plan. Yvonne fell silent for a single second. An expression appeared on her face that he would later recall many times. Surprise. Pure. Genuine. No one in her life had ever asked her opinion on fiscal matters. No one had ever taken her intellect seriously. She was the youngest daughter, beautiful, a suitable bride, a bargaining chip in political deals, not a person, not a thinker, a commodity. And now a stranger, without lineage or a crown, sat across from her and asked for her opinion. On the budget. Seriously. She sat up straight and spoke. For an hour and a half, Daniel listened. He took notes. He asked questions. Yvonne knew economics, not from books, from experience. She had grown up at court and seen how the state's finances worked. She had seen the mistakes. She had seen the solutions. And she had remained silent because no one had asked, until today. When she left, Margaret stood by the door and looked at Daniel, with an expression he couldn't read. Then she said quietly that he had just done something very dangerous. Daniel asked what. Margaret replied that he had given a smart woman a reason to stay. Daniel didn't understand at first. Then he did. And he didn't say anything. That evening, a message arrived from Isla, the first report from the new intelligence operation. The Ostrakomny embassy hadn't left Kronheim. The ambassador had stayed. He'd rented a new house, a bigger one. He'd doubled his security. People were coming to see him. Every day, different people. Isla recognized some of them. Merchants from among those who hadn't bought bonds. Minor nobles from the surrounding estates. And one temple priest from the Academy of Magic. That last fact made Daniel think. Magic. 2% of the population. An aristocratic privilege, controlled by the temple academies. He had almost forgotten about it. In his world, there was no magic, and he was used to thinking without it. But here it was. And if Ostrakommon was drawing the temple into his plans, the matter was more serious than it seemed. He wrote a single word in his notebook. Magic, and underlined it twice. Winter came early. In the 3rd month of Daniel's reign, the first snow blanketed Kronheim overnight. In the morning, the city was white and silent. Beautiful. If one didn't think about what lay behind that beauty, cold, hunger, death for those without a roof or a fire. Daniel stood by the window of his study and looked out at the snow-covered roofs. He was thinking, not about the beauty, about firewood, about bread, about the children in the slums who were now waking up in homes without stoves. Sori walked in without knocking. She had long since stopped knocking. She placed a sheet of paper on the table. Food supplies for the winter. The numbers were bad. Enough grain for 2 months. Firewood for a month and a half. Almost no salted meat. Fish is coming in irregularly because the sea is stormy. Rolf's shipping line was out of commission until spring. Caravans were traveling overland, but slowly. The roads were snowed in. Daniel looked at the numbers and did the math. 30,000 mouths to feed. 2 months of winter ahead. Shortages across the board. In his past life, he would have called this a liquidity crisis. Here, it was called by a simpler name. People would freeze and die. He called a meeting, not a regency council, his own. Margaret, Sori, Gregor, Baron, Bertram, Anel, Yvonne. Torvald from the mines sent a report via courier. Ayla stood by the wall and listened. Lena sat on the windowsill. 8 people around the table. A year ago, none of them knew each other. Now it was a mechanism. Imperfect, creaky, but working. Daniel laid out the problem, briefly, with numbers, without emotion. Then he asked for solutions. Not from himself, from everyone. Gregor suggested requisitioning from nearby estates. Daniel rejected it immediately. Requisitioning is robbery. Bertram did that and lost half his people. Baron suggested purchasing supplies in Halegrave. Daniel nodded. Possibly, but it's expensive and time-consuming. Anel suggested forced redistribution of supplies. Take from the rich, give to the poor. Daniel shook his head. That works once. The second time, the rich will hide everything. Yvonne listened in silence. Then she spoke, quietly, but everyone turned to look at her. She said the problem wasn't the amount of food. The problem was distribution. There is food in the merchants' warehouses, in the temple's storehouses, in the nobles' cellars. There was enough to last the winter, but it was concentrated among those who didn't need it in such quantities, and those who did need it didn't have the money to buy it. Daniel looked at her. She looked back at him, gray-blue eyes, calm, steady. She was right. The problem wasn't the resource, it was access. He asked what she suggested. Yvonne replied, exchange, not money, services. Give people work. Give food in exchange for work, not charity, work, so people don't feel like beggars, so they feel needed. Daniel nodded and developed the idea. Overnight, he drew up a plan. By morning, the plan had become an order. Warming houses, every temple in the city, every school, every large tavern. Open your doors to those freezing, places by the hearth, hot food, shelter. To the owners of temples and taverns, a tax exemption for 6 months, complete exemption from city taxes, a document with the royal seal. To the volunteers working in the warming houses, hot food and a copper coin a day. From what funds? From the bond funds. Sori had recalculated the budget. 20 gold coins a month. A lot, but tolerable. If the mine starts turning a profit by the end of winter, a lot of ifs. But there was no choice. For the children, a place by the hearth, food, a blanket, no strings attached. Daniel signed the order. He affixed his seal. He gave it to Margaret to carry out. Margaret worked for 2 days without sleep. She went around to the churches. She negotiated with the rectors. She persuaded. She pressured. Where necessary, she begged. Where necessary, she gave orders. By the 3rd day, 12 shelters had opened their doors. By the 5th day, 20. By the end of the week, 31. Daniel visited them personally, every day, in the morning, without an entourage, in a simple cloak, carrying a basket of bread he'd fetched himself from the bakery. Gregor walked 3 steps behind and grumbled under his breath. Daniel didn't listen. He needed to see, with his own eyes, not reports, faces. The old man sleeping on the floor by the fireplace, smiling in his sleep. The woman breastfeeding her baby, crying from the heat. The 2 boys playing in the corner with a wooden sword. He saw and remembered every face, every name he recognized. It was important. Not for the administration, for himself. To remember why all this was happening. On the 5th day of his rounds, he walked into the warming house attached to the temple at the western gate. Small, cramped, 20 people inside. It smelled of smoke and boiled cabbage and raw wool. He was handing out bread, smiling, saying hello. And then he saw her, a woman, about 35, dark hair, slender hands. She was sitting by the wall, mending someone's shirt, a seamstress. He stopped. He stood and watched. The world fell silent. It was her, that very woman, from the roadside, from his last night in that world, the one he'd helped change a tire for, before the truck, before everything. She raised her head, looked at him, politely, without recognition. She didn't know him. How could she? Here he was different, different clothes, a different body, maybe even a different face. He didn't know for sure. Mirrors in this world were blurry. But she was the same eyes, the same hands, the same tilt of her head when she listens. He stood there and said nothing. She waited. Then he held out the bread to her. She took it, thanked him, smiled. A polite smile to a stranger. He nodded, turned away, left. It was cold outside. The snow was falling thick and fast, white, silent. Daniel stood there, breathing, deeply, slowly. Gregor stood beside him, silent. He didn't ask. He saw Daniel's face and understood that now was not the time. A panel flashed in his pocket. Daniel looked. Gift of the day 156. Certificate of authenticity. Yes, it was her. The letters glowed on the translucent screen. The system confirmed it. Not a coincidence, not a similar woman, the very one, who existed in two worlds at once, or who had been transported, or who had always been here. He didn't know. And right now it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was alive, that she was warm, that he had given her bread, just as she had once given him a reason to pull over to the side of the road. A circle, complete. Daniel sat down in the snow, right on the ground. His coat was soaked. The cold seeped through the fabric. He didn't care. He sat there and cried, quietly, without a sound. For the first time in 6 months in this world. Gregor stood over him. He said nothing. Then he silently reached out his hand. Daniel took it. He stood up, wiped his face. He looked at Gregor. The captain didn't ask anything. He just walked beside him, back to the palace, across the white snow, in silence. Winter continued. The heating systems were working. People weren't freezing, not everyone. There were casualties, the elderly, the sick, those they couldn't reach in time. Daniel recorded every death, name, age, district, cause. Sori asked why. He replied that the dead deserved to be remembered, and that every death is a failure of the system, his system, which he is obligated to fix by next winter. Sori was silent. Then she said quietly that he couldn't save everyone. He replied that he knew, but he could try. She chewed on the quill and remained silent. Then she placed her hand on his, for a second, and withdrew it. She returned to the numbers. He watched her bowed head, the ink stain on her cheek, her fingers moving across the parchment quickly and precisely. And he thought that if he were asked to name the most beautiful sight in this world, it would not be the mountains or the sea, but a girl who counts by candlelight and bites the tip of a quill. By the end of winter, 2 events had occurred. The first, the mine turned a profit for the first time. Torvald sent a report. Output had risen to 50%, not 60 as planned, but 50. Winter flooding. Ivan was right, seasonality. But even 50% was twice as much as before the reform. The first revenues went toward repaying the bonds. The merchants received their interest, on time, in full. Master Galen came to see Daniel in person, shake hands, said he was ready to invest more. The plot was elegant, professional. If Daniel hadn't set up intelligence, he would have found out about it when the knife went between his ribs. Ayla laid everything out on the table, map, names, connections, lines. 3 former Regency officials, 2 minor nobles from the provinces, 1 commander of the city guard, and a temple priest from the Academy of Magic, the very one Ayla had seen at the Ostrocamni ambassador's residence. The goal of the conspiracy: to overthrow Daniel, to replace him with Lord Whitmore of Ostrocam, the late king's late wife's first cousin, a tenuous bloodline that, with the proper legal formalities, could provide a claim to the throne. Not a strong one, but enough to start a civil war. The method: Daniel's assassination, accusing Bertram, chaos. Amid the chaos, Whitmore appears with an imperial escort. He presents documents. The temple confirms his right through a magical oath. Anel is faced with a choice: recognize Whitmore or go to war with Ostrocammon. She will choose the law, and the law will be on the side of blood. Daniel listened and felt a chill. Not fear, respect. For the one who planned this, it was a well-executed operation, multi-layered, with backup plans, using his own principles against him. He built a system on the law. They used the law to destroy it, a mirror move. He asked Ayla how much time they had. She answered, 2 weeks, maybe 3. Whitmore is still in Ostracam, gathering people. By the time he moves, it will be too late. Daniel nodded. Then he asked about the temple priest, who he is, what he can do, why he's needed. Ayla answered. Father Kelvin, a second-rank mage, not powerful, but his gift allows him to verify the authenticity of documents through a magical oath, a blood oath, one that cannot be broken. In this world, a magical oath held the force of absolute proof. If Kelvin confirms under oath that Whitmore has a right to the throne, the court will accept it. Even Anel will accept it, because a magical oath does not lie. But Daniil fell into thought. But a magical oath does not lie. That means Kelvin must believe what he is saying, or he will be forced to, or he is interpreting the facts in a certain way. A blood connection exists, a tenuous one, but it exists. If the question is phrased correctly, Kelvin can honestly confirm that Whitmore has a blood right. Not an absolute one, but formal. That would be enough. Daniel called a meeting. A small one, just his own people. Margaret, Gregor, Sori, Ayla, Yvonne. He didn't want to include Yvonne. She was Halegrave's spy, formally. But Margaret said quietly that the princess had earned their trust. Daniel agreed. Not because Margaret asked, because in 2 months at court, Yvonne had never once lied, not in big things or small. She was sharp and prickly and sometimes unbearable, but honest, always. He laid out the conspiracy plan before them. The reactions varied. Gregor wanted to arrest everyone immediately. Ayla suggested quietly eliminating the key participants. Margaret turned pale and remained silent. Sori was calculating. Yvonne was listening. Daniel let everyone speak. Then he said there would be no arrests and no eliminations. Everyone looked at him. He explained, an arrest is a scandal. A scandal is instability. Instability is what a Strakaman wants. Elimination is a secret. A secret is something that will come to light sooner or later and turn him from a legitimate king into a murderer. No, he would do it differently. He would deprive the conspiracy of its goal. Not the people, the goal. The plan was simple. Whitmore asserts a blood right, so the blood right must be rendered meaningless. How? By law. The very, very law upon which everything was built. Alberic's will transferred the crown not by blood, but by recognition. It was a precedent. Daniel proposed to codify it, to issue a royal decree, a law of succession. The crown of Valmarsh is transferred not by blood, but by the will of the reigning monarch, confirmed by the Oberhofmeisterin and the council. The right of primogeniture claim ceases to be a basis for a claim to the throne. Anel is needed for the legal formalities. She will accept it, because it is a logical continuation of what has already happened. Yvonne listened and nodded slowly. Then she said that wasn't enough. The law could be challenged. The temple could claim that a blood oath takes precedence over a royal decree. We need to win the temple over to our side, or at least neutralize it. Daniel looked at her. He asked how. Yvonne replied, the healer, the temple healer at court, Sister Celesta. She was assigned after the first assassination attempt. Quiet, unobtrusive. But she's from the Order of the Radiant, the most influential temple order in the region. If Celeste sides with Daniel, the order will stand behind her. Not all of it, but enough of it. Because Celeste isn't just a healer, she's the niece of the High Abbess. Daniel didn't know that. Margaret didn't know. Yvonne knew because in Halegrave, diplomats were taught to know everything about the temple hierarchy. Daniel went to Celeste. She lived in a small room attached to the palace infirmary. Clean, simple. A bed, a table, a shelf with herbs and jars. The scent of chamomile and something bitter. Celeste sat grinding ointment in a mortar. Her chestnut hair was braided. Her hands were red and cracked from work. She looked up when he entered. She stood. She curtsied. He asked her to sit. She sat. He sat across from her. And he didn't talk about politics. He didn't talk about the conspiracy. He didn't ask for help. He asked how her hands were. Celeste blinked. She looked at her palms, then at him. No one had ever asked about her hands. They asked about her gift. They asked about the sick. They asked about herbs and recipes. No one asked about the hands that ached every evening from endless work. She replied quietly that her hands hurt. Always. The joints, the tendons, the cold makes it worse. She was used to it. Daniel nodded. Then he took something out of his pocket. A small thing. A gift from the system on day 73. A thermal artifact. A pair of thin gloves made of a strange material. Warm to the touch. Always. No fire, no magic, just warm. He held them out to Celeste. She took them. She put them on. Her face changed. Her eyes widened. She clenched her fingers, unclenched them. Warmth. Constant. Soft. Penetrating her joints. Relieving the pain that had lived in her hands for years. She looked at her gloved hands and said nothing. Then she looked up at Daniel. They were filled with tears. She asked why. He answered simply, because a healer who heals everyone deserves to have someone take care of him. And one more thing. He asked her not to heal everyone on her own. He asked her to teach other healers, to pass on her knowledge, so that she wouldn't be the only one carrying the entire infirmary on her aching hands. Celeste was silent for a long time. Then she nodded and said quietly that he was the first person in 10 years of service who had seen in her not a gift, but a person. Daniel didn't answer. He stood up, he bowed, he left. A week later, Sister Celeste wrote a letter to her aunt, the Supreme Abbess of the Order of the Radiant Light. Daniel hadn't asked her to do this. She wrote of her own accord. About the new king, about the warm houses, about how he visits them every morning with bread, about the gloves, about the request to teach others. The reply came 10 days later. The Supreme Abbess invited Daniel to an audience. The Temple of Radiant Light, the largest in Kronheim. Daniel went. Alone. Without an entourage. Without Gregor. Gregor nearly fell ill with rage. The abbess turned out to be a small old woman with eyes like a hawk's. She did not rise. He approached. He bowed. She stared at him for 5 minutes, in silence. Then she said he could sit down. He sat down. She asked why he needed the temple. He replied that he did not need the temple. He needed the temple not to be against him. She raised an eyebrow. She asked if that wasn't the same thing. He replied, no. An ally is someone who stands by you. A neutral is someone who doesn't get in the way. Neutrality is enough for him. The abbess was silent. Then she asked what he wanted in return. He replied, freedom. The temple academies will teach freely, without class restrictions. If a peasant child has a gift, he will be accepted on equal footing with a noble. It was a blow. Quiet. Precise. Temple academies had always been a privilege of the nobility. Peasant children with magical gifts were not admitted, not by law, by tradition. The abbess knew this was wrong. She herself had once been a blacksmith's daughter. She had been admitted as an exception, the only one in half a century. She looked at Daniel, and he saw in her eyes what he had seen in Margaret's, recognition, not of faces, of intentions. She nodded. She said the temple would remain neutral, and that Father Kelvin would be summoned for a talk. 3 days later, Kelvin renounced the conspiracy. Quietly, without a scandal. He went to Anel, told her everything, names, dates, plans. Anel took his statement. She documented it. The conspirators were not arrested, Daniel insisted. Instead of arrest, each of them was personally handed a copy of Kelvin's testimony, with the royal seal, and with a note, "We know. We are watching. The choice is yours." 4 of the 6 fled Kronheim that very night. 2 turned themselves in. One of them was the commander of the guard. Daniel did not punish him. He transferred him to the border, farther from the capital, closer to his work. Whitmore never arrived. Ostrocommon received the signal. They had lost the silent war. The loud one remained. But a loud war is expensive, and the Empire didn't like to waste money. The 4th month. Winter was waning. Snow still lay on the ground, but the roads were opening up. The shipping line was up and running again. Rolf led the first spring caravan. 5 boats, full holds, grain, fabrics, tools, iron from the southern ports.
Kronheim sighed. The market came to life. Prices began to fall, slowly, but they were falling. Baron stood on the pier and counted the bales. His face beamed. He told Daniel that this was the best caravan he had ever seen in his entire life. Daniel replied that the next one would be the best. Baron laughed, for the first time in Daniel's presence, loudly, from the gut, like a man who had found joy again. The mine was operating. Torvald sent the quarterly report. Output had risen to 65%, above target. The drainage system was working. 2 flooded shafts had been drained. 50 new workers had been hired. Wages were being paid on time. Conditions had improved. Torvald wrote a single sentence at the end of the report. People were asking when the king would come to see for himself. Daniel read it and set the sheet aside. Then he picked up a quill and wrote a reply. Soon. Definitely. He already knew the king would come, not for an inspection, so the miners could see that the king knew about them, remembered them. A small thing, but in this world where common folk had never seen their sovereign face to face, it was a revolution. The salt industry reform took a month. Daniel abolished the old system under which salt was sold through a single royal intermediary. Instead, he introduced an auction. Merchants bid for the right to purchase batches of salt. The price is market-driven, transparent. The treasury receives the difference. Sori drew up the procedure. Anel checked the legal side of things. Yvonne proposed a key amendment, a minimum price, below which the salt would not be sold, to protect the mine from dumping in case someone wanted to deliberately crash the market. Daniel looked at her with respect. She was thinking 2 moves ahead, just like him. The first auction took place in the throne room. 6 merchants, Baron among them. The bidding was fierce. The price rose 30% above expectations. The treasury received 2,000 gold pieces for a single shipment. Sori jotted down the figure and looked at Daniel. Her eyes were filled with tears. Not from joy, from relief. For the first time in 3 years, the Valmarsh treasury was in the black. Daniel didn't celebrate. Being in the black for a single month isn't a victory. It's a respite. But he allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. The 5th month, an attempted invasion. Ayla brought the news at night. An imperial garrison at the pass, 3,000 soldiers, moving toward the border. Officially, it's a drill. In reality, it's pressure. Sharpstone was baring its teeth. Gregor mustered the troops on alert. 342 men against 3,000. Suicide. Bertram came to Daniel looking grim. He said it was time to prepare the pass's defenses. Daniel said no, not defenses, a letter. Bertram looked at him as if he were crazy. Daniel wrote 4 letters in 1 night. Sori helped. Yvonne helped. Margaret checked the wording. 4 letters to 4 kingdoms. Halegrave, Talmark, Sudmark, Asteria. 4 of the 7 crowns. The content was the same. Different tones, different arguments, but one message. The Empire of Ostroka is violating the Treaty of the 7 Crowns, military pressure on a sovereign kingdom. If Valmarsh falls next, you will be next. Not a threat. Fact. Math. Daniel attached a copy of Sori's financial report to each letter, showing the falsification of debt, showing that Ostrokaman acts not out of right, but out of greed.
He attached a copy of the trade agreement with Halegrave, showing that Valmarch is not a beggar but a growing partner. And he included a personal appeal: simple, human. He wrote that he is not asking for armies, not asking for money. He is asking for one thing: voices. If the Four Kingdoms publicly declare that an invasion of Valmarch would be a violation of the Treaty of the Seven Crowns, Ostrokoman will stop. Because war with one small kingdom is a piece of cake. War with four is a disaster. The letters were sent by Ayla's couriers. Fast. Reliable. A week later, the first reply arrived. Halegrave. King Devault supported it. Publicly. 3 days later, Talmark, then Sudmark. Asteria hesitated, but once 3 had spoken out, the 4th could not remain silent. 2 weeks later, the Four Kingdoms issued a joint statement. Any military invasion of Velmarch's territory would be considered a violation of the Treaty of the Seven Crowns, with the corresponding consequences. The Imperial garrison at the pass held its ground for another week. Then it quietly withdrew. 3,000 soldiers returned to their barracks, without a single shot fired, without a single casualty. Daniel stood on the wall of Kronheim and looked east, toward the mountains beyond which lay the Empire. Gregor stood beside him. He was silent.
Then he said quietly that in 20 years of service, this was the first time he had seen a war stopped by letters.
Daniel replied that letters were the most powerful weapon. It's just that few know how to use them. Gregor grunted, but he didn't object. The 6th month. Time to build. Not walls, the future. Daniel announced the creation of the first Royal School of Arithmetic. For merchants' children, for peasants' children, for anyone who wants to learn. Free of charge, funded by the Treasury. Margaret found a building. An old merchant's house near the market square. 2 stories, large rooms, bright windows. Daniel drew up the seating plan himself, a habit from his past life. Open space. Only instead of computers, there were wooden tables with slate boards. There were 3 teachers. Sori, who taught arithmetic and the basics of bookkeeping. Old Marco Khan, Sori's father, whom Daniel had pulled out of the port docks and put in charge of teaching. Marco cried when he heard the offer.
Not out of joy, out of shame. He considered himself a failure. Daniel sat down with him and spent an hour with him. He explained that a failure isn't someone who's been cheated. A failure is someone who, after being cheated, stopped believing in themselves. Marco listened. Then he straightened his back and he went to prepare his first lesson. Daniel himself became the 3rd teacher. He taught 1 lesson a week, every Saturday. The basics of logical thinking, problems, brain teasers, simple principles from which complex solutions grow. The children watched the king standing at the blackboard with chalk in his hand, drawing flowcharts. They didn't understand half of it, but they listened, with their mouths agape, because they had never in their lives seen an adult explain the world like that. Not with orders, not with dogmas, but with questions. Why? What for? What if? Lena was the first to sign up. She sat at the front desk and looked at Sori with an expression of absolute delight. When Sori gave her a problem, Lena solved it faster than anyone else, not because she was smarter, because she wanted it more. Daniel looked at her and thought about how, a year ago, this girl had been selling stale flatbreads for a penny at the gate of an abandoned chapel. The 7th month. The anniversary was approaching. Daniel was working, every day, 16 hours a day, sometimes 18. Sori made him eat, Margaret made him sleep, Gregor made him get some fresh air, Yvonne made him laugh. She would come to his office with reports and, instead of numbers, start telling him what she'd heard at court, like how the cook tried to make a dish using Daniel's recipe and nearly burned down the kitchen, how Gregor explained to the soldiers what leave was and they decided it was a punishment, how Lena called a deadline a Korean swear word, and now the whole court uses that word when they're angry. Daniel laughed, and every time he noticed how Ivan looked at his laughter intently, as if at something precious. The end of the first year. The treasury in the black for the first time in the black. The mine at 70% capacity. Trade is growing. The roads are safe. The school is open. The warming houses have become year-round shelters. 3 healers trained by Celeste. 1 infirmary. Daniel delivered his first throne speech without a script. 200 people in the hall. He didn't promise paradise. He promised work. When he finished, Gregor stood up and began pounding his fist on his breastplate. Bertram followed him, then the soldiers, then everyone. It wasn't an ovation. It was an oath. A year and a half. Kronheim was changing. Roofs were being repaired. The market was bustling. In the streets, children in the School of Arithmetic uniforms ran to their classes. The mine reached 80% capacity. Torvald became a legend among the miners. The shipping line expanded to 12 captains and 6 ports. Velmarish salt cheaper than imperial salt. Ostrokman was losing markets. In the 16th month, Ayla uncovered a conspiracy by Houghton's men, poisoning via the cook. Daniel insisted on a public trial, the first in Valmarsh's history where the accused was given a chance to speak. The verdict: not execution, exile to a monastery on the islands. A dead Houghton is a martyr. A living one in a monastery is a nobody. The rumor spread across the continent. A king who does not kill. 2 months later, scholars, artisans, and mages from all over Erin began flocking to the court. Yvonne wrote an encrypted letter to her father. Ayla intercepted it. She showed it to Daniel. Yvonne wrote that this man considers her intelligent and that she is not leaving. Daniel ordered Ayla to stop intercepting her letters. Trust cannot be built on surveillance. The 20th month. In the palace basement, behind a sealed door, Daniel found a diary. 300 years old, leather-bound. Author, Aoi Mitsuko. A woman from Edo period Japan, the third chosen one. She ruled Valmarsh for 40 years, built a port, founded a mine, wrote the first laws, and recorded everything, every fear, every sleepless night. The last entry. Day 14,600. A gift. A blank scroll. An inscription. Write the rest yourself. Beneath it, a single line. I never made up my mind. Daniel read and recognized himself. 6 chosen ones before him. 3 went mad. 2 left. 1 didn't choose. 1 perished. He is the 7th. 2 years. After the failure of military pressure, Ostrocommon switched to an embargo. Revenues fell by 30%. Daniel rerouted trade through southern routes and lowered the price of salt below the imperial rate. Madness. But volumes were growing. Customers were switching from Ostrocommon. The empire was losing money. Grand Duke Cassian proposed a meeting. Everyone advised him to refuse. Daniel agreed. A castle on the border. Dinner at 4 o'clock. Cassian turned out not to be a villain. Intelligent, subtle, respectful of his opponent. He said he was impressed. But a debt is a debt. Daniel placed a folder on the table. A full recalculation of Sori. The actual debt isn't 200,000, 63. And the Empire's losses from the conflict over 2 years, 190,000. More than the entire debt, Daniel said quietly. It's more profitable to let us go. Cassian laughed, respectfully. He said it was the first time he'd seen a negotiator with an accounting ledger. A month later, Sharpstone accepted the terms. 75,000 over 7 years. Daniel agreed. 12,000 in overpayment is the price of peace. The day the trade union with Halegrave. The throne room is full. 300 people, ambassadors from the 4 kingdoms, and all his people. Gregor by the door in a blue doublet with silver. Margaret by the throne with a white rose on her chest. Sori at the table over the documents. Isla by the wall, invisible. Celesta among the temple representatives, hands in warm gloves, Yvonne next to the Helgrave ambassador, for the first time without irony in her eyes, and Lena, 16 years old, head of the courier service, in a blue cloak with a silver owl. After signing, Daniel stepped out onto the balcony. Kronheim at night. Lights in the windows of its schools and infirmaries and warm homes. Midnight. The panel. Day 730. A gift. An empty scroll. The inscription appeared in gold ink. Write the rest yourself, just like with Aoi. 300 years between them. One question, to stay or to leave. He thought of Seattle, of his mother, of a life that no longer exists. Then of Kronheim, of the girl with the flatbreads who became head of the couriers, of the treasurer who bites her pen, of the old woman who wept over white roses, of the princess who stayed. Then he took out a quill, an old one, worn down, the one Sori used to write her first books, the one Lena used to write her name for the first time. And he wrote a single line. Meeting tomorrow at 8. Agenda. Spring planting campaign. He rolled up the scroll. He walked back into the hall. Margaret asked quietly if everything was all right. He nodded, said he was home, walked past Gregor, past Sori with her smile that took his breath away, past Lena, who handed him a cup of tea. He sat down in his office. He took out a blank sheet of paper. He began to write a plan. Land, seeds, people. Snow was falling outside the window. There was a lot of work ahead. He smiled and continued writing.